It started as just another quiet night shift. Dispatch had sent me out to check on a disturbance call. Routine stuff. Some teenager's party getting too loud, I assumed. The address led me to a crumbling old house on the edge of town, isolated and half-eaten by the forest. When I arrived, the place was dark. Too dark. The kind of dark that swallows your flashlight beam. The front door was ajar, creaking lazily in the night breeze. I radioed in my arrival, but static crackled back instead of dispatch's usual monotone confirmation. Strange. It wasn't like this area was a dead zone for the radios. As I pushed the door open further, the hinges screamed. My flashlight scanned the inside, a gutted living room filled with cobwebs and furniture draped in dusty sheets. There were no signs of a wild party, just silence so thick it pressed against my chest. "Police!" I called out, my voice breaking the eerie calm. No response, just the faint sound of something dripping deeper in the house. That's when I noticed the footprints, muddy barefoot tracks leading from the door into the shadows. The dripping sound grew louder as I followed the tracks through a narrow hallway. My boots echoed unnaturally loud against the wood floor. Every creak felt like a warning. Then the smell hit, coppery and sharp. Blood. I stepped into a room at the end of the hall and froze. There was a circle of candles on the floor, their flames dancing erratically, like they were caught in some invisible storm. Inside the circle lay a body, a man, his throat slit so deeply his head hung at an unnatural angle. His lifeless eyes were wide open, staring up at the ceiling as though he'd died, seeing something unimaginable. I had to fight the urge to bolt. Instead, I leaned in to get a closer look. That's when I saw it. A word scrawled on the floorboards in blood, directly beneath him. "Welcome." It was fresh, dripping into the cracks of the wood. And then, from somewhere deeper in the house, I heard the laughter. I stared at the screen in disbelief. The figure in the live feed was a perfect reflection of me, down to the uniform, the flashlight, and even the strained expression on my face. Yet, here I was, standing in the station. Dana's hands trembled as she turned the monitor toward me. "I called for backup when you didn't respond. They went to the house and found your car still there, but no sign of you." "That's impossible," I whispered. My heart pounded as a chilling thought crept into my mind. What if I never left that house? The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I glanced at my reflection in the station's glass door. My breath caught in my throat. The reflection wasn't following my movements. While I stood frozen, it leaned closer to the glass, its eyes dark pits. "I think I'm losing it," I murmured, stepping back. Dana gasped, her eyes darting from me to the screen. The figure in the live feed was moving now, slowly raising a hand to wave at the camera. At the same moment, my reflection in the glass mimicked the gesture. I hadn't moved. My radio crackled to life, a distorted voice cutting through the static. "Officer down. Officer down. Request backup at Willow Street." The voice was mine. I bolted for the door, but before I could reach it, the lights in the station flickered and went out. The only illumination came from the glow of the live feed, which now showed not just one figure, but several. They crowded the windows of the house, all identical to me, their faces twisted in mockery. Dana screamed, and I turned to see her backing away from her desk. A shadow darker than anything I'd ever seen was stretching from the corner of the room, oozing across the floor like liquid night. It reached for her, tendrils curling around her ankles. "Help me!" she cried, her voice breaking. I lunged forward, grabbing her arms and pulling with all my strength, but the shadow was relentless, dragging her inch by inch. Her eyes widened in terror as it pulled her into the darkness. Her scream cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. I stumbled back, panting, the room now eerily still. The monitors were dead, the radio silent. I was alone, or so I thought. Behind me, the floor creaked. Slowly, I turned. In the dim light, I saw them. Figures identical to me, standing in a line, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting some unseen light. "You don't belong here," one of them said, its voice a distorted version of mine. I backed away, reaching for the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. The figures advanced, their movements synchronized, their expressions blank. "This isn't real," I whispered, trying to convince myself. "This isn't real." One of the figures smiled, a grotesque, unnatural stretch of its mouth. "It is now." With no other option, I turned and threw myself at the glass door, shattering it. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I ran. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, parked at the station's edge. I drove aimlessly, my hands trembling on the wheel. The town seemed different, the streets unfamiliar. No matter where I turned, I couldn't find my way home. Eventually, I stopped at a gas station on the outskirts of town. The attendant gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside. "Rough night, officer?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He slid a newspaper across the counter. "You might want to see this." My blood ran cold as I read the headline. "Police officer found dead in abandoned house on Willow Street." The photo beneath it was of me. I stumbled back, the world spinning around me. "That's not possible," I muttered. "I'm right here." The attendant frowned, his eyes narrowing. "Sure you are, buddy." I turned and caught my reflection in the station window. My face stared back, but my eyes, they weren't mine. They were dark, bottomless voids. And then, just for a moment, I smiled. The dispatcher's voice crackled through my cruiser's radio. "Unit 22, report to Old Pinecrest Road. Suspicious activity, possible break-in at the abandoned Kavanaugh estate. Caller reports strange lights inside." I exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel. The Kavanaugh estate, a relic of local legend. It had been abandoned for decades, ever since the last Kavanaugh family member vanished without a trace. People whispered stories about it, about hauntings, cults, even aliens, but I'd always chalked it up to small-town boredom. Still, I was already 10 hours into my shift and didn't need the adrenaline rush this call promised. I pulled up to the estate a few minutes later. The house stood like a specter in the fog, its windows gaping like empty sockets. My spotlight cut across the overgrown lawn, revealing nothing but mist and weeds. Yet the front door, swollen and warped from years of neglect, was ajar. The radio crackled again. "Backup ETA 15 minutes. "Roger that," I muttered. 15 minutes? A lot could happen in 15 minutes. I stepped out of the car, hand on my sidearm. Every cop instinct screamed at me to wait, but the faint flicker of light from inside drew me forward. Maybe it was just kids messing around, or squatters. Yeah, squatters. That's what I told myself. The porch creaked under my boots as I approached the door. The light was faint now, like a candle being carried deeper into the house. I drew my flashlight and shined it through the opening. Dust floated thick in the beam, and the air smelled damp, like mildew and rot. "This is the police," I called out, voice steady despite the chill crawling up my spine. "If anyone's in there, make yourself known." Silence answered me, stretching long enough to make me doubt the call. Maybe the homeowner just thought they'd seen something. But then, faint and distant, I heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and too far away to belong to anyone who'd just bolted for the back door. I stepped inside, every creak of the floorboards announcing my presence. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with warped paneling and doors hanging on rusted hinges. My flashlight swept across an old mirror, cracked and tarnished, reflecting my face back at me in distorted fragments. The light flickered again, deeper in the house. The footsteps continued, growing louder and heavier, like boots dragging across the floor. They didn't seem hurried, but steady, purposeful. I tightened my grip on my sidearm and moved toward the source. Each step I took felt wrong, as though the house itself wanted me gone. The air grew colder, the damp smell giving way to something sharper, metallic, like blood. I reached the base of a grand staircase, its banister twisted and blackened from years of rot. The light was coming from above now, a faint glow at the top of the stairs. My mouth felt dry as I called out again. "This is the police. I'm armed. If anyone's up there, come down slowly with your hands where I can see them." Nothing. The sound of footsteps resumed, this time from the second floor. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as they moved, pacing back and forth above me. I stepped onto the first creaking stair, and as I did, the pacing stopped. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper reached my ears. I froze, straining to make out the words, but they didn't sound like any language I knew. They weren't words at all, just a low, rhythmic murmuring. I ascended the stairs, my flashlight beam bouncing with each shaky step. The hallway at the top stretched into darkness, lined with more rooms, all of their doors slightly ajar. The light was coming from the farthest room, its door fully open, casting a faint, flickering glow into the hallway. As I approached, the murmuring grew louder, almost chanting now, but still incomprehensible. The words crawled into my ears and settled there, twisting into shapes I couldn't comprehend. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but my legs kept moving, carrying me toward the door. The room was empty, save for a single object in the center, an old, cracked mirror, its surface glowing faintly with a light that had no source. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't quite right. The face was mine, but the eyes were too wide, the expression too calm, and then it smiled. I stumbled back, heart hammering as my reflection stepped forward. I raised my flashlight, its beam cutting across the mirror's surface, but the image remained clear, untouched by the light. The thing that looked like me reached out, pressing a hand against the glass, and I swear I felt it on my chest, a cold, hollow pressure pushing me back. The mirror cracked suddenly, a spiderweb of fractures racing across its surface. The chanting stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. I stood frozen, waiting for something, anything to happen. The house erupted in noise. Every door in the hallway slammed shut, one after the other, the echoes shaking the floor beneath me. A gust of icy wind blasted through the hallway, extinguishing my flashlight and leaving me in total darkness. I fumbled for my radio, breath coming in ragged gasps. "This is Unit 22. I need backup immediately. There's something in here with me." My voice cracked as I spoke, but I didn't care. I wasn't staying in that house another second. As I turned to flee, a hand shot out from the darkness, grabbing my arm. It was ice cold, the grip impossibly strong. I twisted, trying to break free, and the beam of my flashlight flickered back to life, illuminating the hallway. No one was there. I bolted down the stairs, my pulse pounding in my ears. The front door loomed ahead like salvation, and I didn't stop running until I burst outside, gasping for air. My cruiser's lights were a welcome sight in the fog. I jumped in, locked the doors, and waited for backup, every nerve on edge. When the other units arrived, they found nothing. The house was silent, still, and empty. No lights, no sounds, no broken mirror, just dust and decay. They looked at me like I was losing my mind, but I didn't care. I quit the force 2 weeks later. Some nights, though, when I close my eyes, I hear those whispers again. And sometimes, in the mirror, I catch a glimpse of something that isn't quite me, smiling back. I tried to move on after that night. I told myself it was the stress, the fatigue, my mind playing tricks on me. That's what everyone else said when I told them pieces of what happened, carefully leaving out the parts no one would believe. But deep down, I knew it wasn't stress. It wasn't a hallucination. I moved out of town shortly after quitting the force, hoping that putting distance between myself and the Kavanaugh estate would quiet the whispers. For a while, it worked. I found a quiet town, took a desk job, and even started sleeping through the night again. The memories dulled, became less sharp, less immediate, until tonight. It started with the mirror in my bathroom. I was brushing my teeth, lost in thought, when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the dim light, a smudge on the glass or a shadow cast by the streetlight outside. But it wasn't. The reflection in the mirror wasn't me. The figure staring back was me in shape and form, but hollow, lifeless. Its eyes were wide and too bright, like glass marbles catching the light, and its mouth was twisted into that same unnerving smile. I froze, toothbrush halfway to my mouth, as it tilted its head slightly, observing me like I was the one out of place. My chest tightened, panic clawing its way up my throat. I stepped back from the mirror, and as I did, the reflection moved forward, pressing its palms against the glass, just like before. I stumbled out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut, heart hammering like it would burst out of my chest. I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I sat in the living room staring at the bathroom door, my phone clutched in my hand. Should I call someone? Who? The police? What would I even say? By dawn, I convinced myself it had been another stress-induced hallucination. That's all it could be. I needed to get out of the house, clear my head. I grabbed my keys and headed to my car, desperate to feel the sun on my skin and the world around me again. But when I turned to lock my door, I caught sight of something in the corner of my eye. The bathroom window, small and square, was fogged up, as though someone had breathed on it. And there, slowly fading, were the words written in the condensation. "You can't run." My blood turned to ice. My body locked up, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. The wind picked up around me, carrying a faint, almost melodic whisper. It was the same rhythm I'd heard in that cursed house. That voice I'll never forget. I ran to my car and didn't stop driving until I was hours away. Even now, sitting in this motel room, writing this down, I feel like something is watching me. The mirror above the dresser has been covered with a blanket, but every time I look away, I feel its presence, as if it's daring me to lift the cover, to see what's waiting on the other side. I don't know if I'll sleep tonight, or ever again. I don't know if I'll stay in this town, or keep running. But what I do know is this: the thing in that house, in the mirrors, isn't finished with me. It let me go once, but I don't think it's going to let me go again. If you ever hear about the Kavanaugh estate, if anyone tells you about strange lights or whispers, or the mirrors inside, do yourself a favor. Don't investigate, don't be curious, and whatever you do, don't look too long into your reflection. You might not like what looks back. It started with a call I shouldn't have taken. The dispatcher's voice was steady, but had that edge of controlled panic they usually reserve for the worst kinds of scenes. "We have a code 99, downtown, Maple Avenue and 6th Street. Units are en route. but your proximity makes you the first responder. I was off duty, at home, sitting in front of a half-eaten pizza, feet up, my phone on speaker. But that code, a code 99, is a mandatory officer in distress situation. It doesn't matter if you're off duty or halfway across the state. You go. I grabbed my badge, slipped my off-duty piece into its holster, and bolted out the door. My heart thudded harder with every red light I ran. Code 99S don't just mean trouble. They scream chaos, danger, and sometimes a body count. When I pulled up to Maple and 6th, it wasn't the scene I expected. The squad car was empty, parked haphazardly in the middle of the street with the driver's side door open. Its lights were still flashing, casting blue and red strobes that danced off the darkened windows of the closed storefronts. No officer in sight. I radioed in. Unit 2034 responding to code 99. No visual on the officer. What's the situation? The line crackled, but there was no reply. I leaned into the cruiser and scanned the interior. Everything was intact. Radio, body cam, sidearm mount. No signs of a struggle. But there was something off. The air inside the car smelled metallic, sharp, almost like the sting of ozone before a lightning strike. That's when I noticed it. The camera mounted on the dashboard wasn't recording forward-facing traffic. It had been swiveled around, pointing into the back seat, and the screen was still on, showing a frozen frame of something. I leaned closer. At first glance, it looked like a face, a blurry, distorted face with wide, vacant eyes and a mouth that stretched open like a scream caught mid-gasp. But the more I stared, the less human it seemed. The features were warped, smudged, almost as if it had been photographed through rippling water. My stomach knotted. It wasn't a reflection. The camera wasn't facing anything reflective. Whatever it was there. I stepped back from the cruiser, my pulse hammering in my ears. The street around me was silent, unnaturally so. Even in the dead of night, you expect the faint hum of distant traffic or the rustle of leaves. But here, nothing. It felt like the world was holding its breath. I radioed again. Dispatch, Unit 2034. I need backup at Maple and 6th. The officer is unaccounted for, and there's something unusual here. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. The static hissed. Then the faintest whisper broke through. It wasn't dispatch. It was lower, rougher, like sandpaper dragged over stone. Help me. I froze. Who is this? Identify yourself. The voice came again, weaker now, but laced with urgency. In the alley. I turned toward the narrow alley, beside a boarded-up diner. The flashing cruiser lights barely penetrated the gloom, casting faint, distorted shadows on the brick walls. Every instinct screamed at me to wait for backup, but I couldn't shake the image of that face frozen on the dash cam. If someone was in danger, I had to act. I drew my gun and flashlight, stepping cautiously into the alley. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing scattered trash and graffiti-covered walls. At first, it seemed empty. Then I spotted movement. A figure slumped against the far wall, just outside the range of my light. Police. Show me your hands, I called, moving closer. The figure didn't respond. As I approached, my flashlight illuminated a uniform. The missing officer. He was sitting upright, his head tilted back against the wall, eyes open, but unfocused. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Relief flooded me for a moment, but it was short-lived. His radio crackled at his side. I crouched and reached for it, but before I could grab it, his hand shot out, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. His eyes snapped to mine, wide and wild. "Don't let it touch you," he rasped. Before I could ask what he meant, the air around us changed. A deep, bone-deep chill settled in, and the shadows at the far end of the alley seemed to ripple, as if alive. My flashlight flickered. Then I saw it. At first, it looked like just another shadow, darker than the rest, slinking along the ground. But as it approached, it began to rise, taking shape. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face, or what should have been a face, was featureless, save for those same empty, gaping eyes I'd seen on the dash cam. The officer let go of my wrist, slumping back, his strength gone. I scrambled to my feet, raising my weapon. "Stop, don't come any closer." My voice echoed uselessly in the confined space. It didn't stop. It didn't hesitate. The thing moved with the inevitability of a tide, closing the distance between us in horrifying silence. I fired. Once, twice, 3 times. The shots rang out, deafening in the alley. But the thing didn't even flinch. The bullets passed through it, punching harmlessly into the brick wall behind it. Then it reached for me. I stumbled back, tripping over the officer's legs, and fell hard onto the pavement. The thing loomed over me, its shadow engulfing mine. My flashlight flickered one last time and died, plunging us into darkness. But even without the light, I could feel it. An overwhelming presence pressing down, suffocating, consuming. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was caving in. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was those hollow eyes staring into mine, endless and empty. I woke up to the harsh glare of daylight and the blaring sirens of approaching squad cars. I was lying in the middle of the street, the cruiser still parked where I'd left it. The officer was gone. So was the thing. The responding units found me dazed and barely coherent. They chalked it up to stress, maybe exhaustion. No one believed me when I tried to explain. The dashcam footage, wiped clean. No trace of the face I'd seen. No record of my encounter. It was as if nothing had happened. But it did happen. I can still feel its eyes on me, even now, in the quiet moments when I'm alone. It's out there, waiting, lurking in the shadows. And every time I close my eyes, I hear that voice again. Help me. It was supposed to be a quiet escape, a weekend alone in a cabin deep in the woods, no distractions, just me, a few books, and the endless sound of leaves brushing against the wind. I had rented the place off a small website that specialized in remote getaways. No ratings, no reviews, but the photos sold me. It looked peaceful, and God knows I needed peace. I arrived just before sunset, and everything seemed perfect. The cabin stood in a clearing, surrounded by tall pines that swallowed most of the sky. There was a creek nearby, and the air smelled of moss and damp earth. Inside, it was cozy, a wood-burning stove, a single bed, and an old oak table by a window overlooking the woods. But the first oddity, the key wasn't where the owner said it would be. The email instructions were clear. Keys under the mat. It wasn't. I ended up finding it inside the mailbox, and while that wasn't too strange, it still gave me pause. Who leaves keys in a mailbox? Shaking it off, I unlocked the door, dropped my bag, and settled in. By the time the sun dipped below the tree line, I was already sipping a cup of tea and flipping through a novel. It felt like the beginning of the tranquility I'd been chasing. That peace didn't last long. Just as darkness enveloped the cabin, I heard the sound, a faint rhythmic tapping. I froze, straining my ears. It came from the window by the oak table, a soft yet deliberate knock, 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 as if someone, or something, was using a single finger to tap the glass. I turned slowly, heart pounding. There was nothing there. Just blackness, no moonlight, no stars, just an impenetrable void. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe a branch, and forced my attention back to the book. The tapping stopped, but 5 minutes later, it started again. This time, from the front door. I didn't get up. Something deep in my gut told me not to. Instead, I grabbed my phone and checked for signal. No bars. Figures. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The tapping ceased. A long silence followed. Then, as if it was mocking me, the sound moved to the back door. Knock, knock, knock. I wanted to laugh at how cliché it was. I even muttered to myself, "You're imagining things." But I knew I wasn't. The sound was too real, too calculated. Gathering my courage, I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and approached the back door. My hand shook as I reached for the knob, the beam of light jittering across the wood. When I finally opened it, there was nothing. Just darkness and the quiet hum of the forest. Then I looked down. Footprints. They weren't human. The prints were elongated, with claw-like marks digging into the soft dirt. My heart dropped. They led away from the cabin, disappearing into the blackness of the trees. I slammed the door and locked it. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to leave, but my car was parked half a mile down the dirt road. No way was I walking through those woods at night. I decided to wait it out, sitting in the middle of the room with every light in the cabin on. Hours passed, and nothing happened. No more tapping, no more footprints. By 3 a.m., I convinced myself I'd overreacted, that it was probably an animal, and I was being ridiculous. I managed to fall asleep. Then I woke up to the sound of breathing. It was faint, shallow, and right outside the bedroom window. I didn't move, didn't even breathe myself. My eyes darted to the clock. 4:13 a.m. The breathing grew louder, more labored, and then something scraped against the window. My stomach churned as the scraping turned to a low, guttural growl. I reached for the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. Instead, I crept out of bed, moving silently toward the window. I positioned myself just out of sight, and with one swift motion, pulled back the curtain. The flashlight beam revealed a face. It wasn't human. The skin was pale, stretched tightly over a skull-like structure. Its eyes were black voids, reflecting the beam like polished obsidian. The mouth, filled with jagged teeth, was impossibly wide, and it twisted into something that could only be described as a grin. I screamed, dropping the flashlight as the creature lunged at the glass, its claws raking against it. The window didn't break, but the force of its attack sent me scrambling backward. I didn't think. I grabbed my bag, threw on my boots, and bolted out the front door. I didn't care about the woods, or the dark, or the footprints. Anything was better than staying in that cabin. As I sprinted down the dirt road, I could hear it behind me. Its guttural growls and heavy, uneven footsteps grew louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice. The creature's growls were just feet away when I finally got the door open and threw myself inside. I started the engine and peeled out of there, the tires kicking up gravel. In the rearview mirror, I saw it standing in the middle of the road, its wide grin illuminated by the red glow of my taillights. I drove straight to the nearest town and didn't stop until I was parked in a well-lit gas station. I spent the rest of the night in the car, locked with the engine running, until the sun came up. I told myself I'd call the cabin owner, demand an explanation, maybe even report what I'd seen, but I never did, because deep down, I knew no one would believe me. And honestly, I don't want to know what that thing was. I didn't go home that morning. Instead, I drove aimlessly, putting as much distance as possible between me and that cabin. Every so often, I'd glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing following me down the road. But the road remained empty, save for the occasional car or truck. After about 3 hours of driving, I pulled into a diner off the highway. My hands were still trembling as I sipped a cup of coffee, the warmth doing little to settle my nerves. The waitress noticed my state, but thankfully she didn't ask questions. I couldn't have answered them if she had. Once I felt steady enough, I pulled out my phone. Despite the terrible signal, I managed to search for the rental website. But when I typed in the address of the cabin, something strange happened. The listing was gone. No photos, no description, nothing. It was as if it had never existed. A chill ran down my spine. How could that be? I checked my email for the confirmation details, the payment receipt, anything to prove I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The emails were gone, completely wiped from my inbox. I stared at the screen, trying to process what this meant. My mind raced with possibilities. Had the owner taken it down after what happened? Did someone erase it deliberately? Or was it something worse? Something I couldn't begin to understand. As I sat there, the events of the previous night played over and over in my head. The tapping, the footprints, the creature's face, and that grin. God, I'd never forget that grin. It wasn't just a predator's smile. It was knowing, as if it took pleasure in my terror. By the time I left the diner, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to talk about it. Not to the police, not to friends, not to anyone. People wouldn't believe me, and honestly, I didn't want them to. The last thing I needed was someone curious enough to go looking for that place. For weeks after, I had nightmares. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, hearing that guttural growl or feeling the weight of those black, empty eyes staring at me. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the mind, some bizarre hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But deep down, I knew better. About a month later, something happened that shattered whatever flimsy logic I'd been clinging to. I was at a friend's housewarming party, trying to force some normalcy back into my life. I'd been avoiding social gatherings, but this one felt safe. Just a few familiar faces, some drinks, and no mention of cabins or woods. For a while, it worked. I almost felt like myself again. Then someone new arrived, a friend of a friend. He was tall, lanky, and a little awkward. Nothing unusual. But as he stepped into the room, I felt my stomach drop. There was something about the way he moved, the way his eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail. It reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. And then he smiled. It wasn't the same grin, not exactly. But there was an echo of it in the way his lips curled, just a little too wide. His teeth, just a little too sharp. I froze, my drink slipping from my hand and shattering on the floor. The room went silent as everyone turned to look at me. The stranger's eyes locked onto mine, and for a split second, I swore I saw something flicker in their depths, something dark and endless, like the void outside that cabin window. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice perfectly normal, perfectly human. I muttered an apology, blaming the spilled drink, and quickly excused myself. But as I left the party, I felt his gaze follow me all the way to the door. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew where I'd been, what I'd seen, maybe even what had followed me back. That was a year ago. I moved to a new city after that, far from any woods or cabins. I keep to myself, avoiding crowds and strangers, and I never ever let myself be alone at night. But every so often I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that moves just a little too fast, or a figure standing too still in a crowded place. And when I look, it's gone. I don't know what I brought back from that cabin, or if it was ever truly gone in the first place. All I know is this: Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. The cabin wasn't supposed to be rented out that night. That's what the guy at the front desk mumbled, his eyes darting nervously between me and the old reservation book. "Ah, yes, we had a cancellation," he said, sliding the key across the counter without meeting my gaze. You'll have it all to yourself." That's what I wanted, a secluded retreat in the middle of nowhere. It had been a rough year, and the idea of quiet solitude in a rustic, isolated cabin seemed like a perfect way to reset. Still, his hesitation nagged at me as I drove up the winding gravel path into the woods. The cabin sat on a ridge overlooking a dark, still lake. It looked just as advertised, cozy, weathered, and welcoming. But as I parked my car and stepped out into the cold air, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. Something about the way the trees seemed to close in, the utter lack of sound, felt wrong. Shaking it off, I hauled my bags inside and locked the door. The interior was just as quaint as I'd hoped. A stone fireplace, hand-carved furniture, and a creaky old staircase leading to a loft bedroom. The only oddity was the massive antique mirror mounted above the fireplace, its ornate frame gleaming in the flickering light of the single lantern I'd brought in. I remember thinking it didn't fit the rustic aesthetic. It was too grand, too heavy, almost regal. Its reflective surface seemed to suck up the dim light, making the room feel darker. I shrugged and lit the fire, settling in for what I thought would be an uneventful night. The fire crackled warmly, its glow casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Despite the warmth, an unease I couldn't shake lingered. It wasn't the isolation, I'd craved that, but the oppressive quiet. No wind in the trees, no chirping insects, not even the gentle lap of the lake against the shore. It was as if the world beyond the cabin didn't exist. I chalked it up to nerves and poured myself a drink, sinking into the worn armchair by the fire. The mirror loomed above me, reflecting the flames in a strange, warped way. I tried to ignore it, but my eyes kept drifting back, drawn by a flicker of movement. Something in the reflection, just at the edge, didn't match the room. I leaned forward, squinting at the mirror. Behind me, the reflection showed a faint, shadowy figure standing near the staircase. My heart stopped. Slowly, I turned my head. Nothing. Just the empty staircase. I laughed it off, a trick of the light, I told myself. The whiskey playing games. I decided to head to bed. Climbing the creaky stairs, I tried to ignore how the air seemed heavier, thicker, as if the cabin itself was exhaling around me. The loft bedroom was cozy, the bed piled high with heavy quilts. I crawled in, pulling the covers tight, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound seemed amplified, the ticking of the old clock on the wall, the faint rustle of the trees outside, and footsteps. No, that was impossible. I froze, listening intently. There it was again. Soft, deliberate, moving across the cabin floor below me. My throat went dry. I had locked the door, hadn't I? Quietly, I slipped out of bed and crept to the edge of the loft. Peering down into the living room, my stomach churned. The fire had gone out, leaving the room in darkness, except for the mirror. It shimmered faintly, like a pond catching moonlight, and in its surface, I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, moving in the room below, their shapes vague and wrong. They didn't walk. They drifted, their limbs too long, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of the rug. The noise echoed through the cabin, and instantly all movement in the mirror stopped. Every figure turned, their hollow eyes locking onto me. Then, one by one, They began to climb the stairs. Panic surged through me. I ran to the bed and grabbed the lantern, its feeble light casting weak beams into the dark. The footsteps were louder now, impossibly heavy. I could hear the wood groan under their weight. I didn't wait to see what would emerge from the shadows. I bolted for the window. I threw it open, the icy air biting my face. The drop wasn't far, maybe 10 feet, but the ground below was jagged with rocks and tree roots. Behind me, I heard the creak of the top step. No time. I jumped, landing hard and rolling painfully onto my side. For a moment, I lay there, gasping, until I heard them again. The footsteps now outside, crunching on the gravel path behind me. I didn't look back. I ran, crashing through the woods, branches clawing at my face and arms. The forest felt endless, the trees pressing in from all sides. I stumbled into the lake's clearing, its black water rippling faintly in the moonlight. My car was just ahead, parked near the edge. I could see the faint glint of its windshield. Behind me, the footsteps grew louder, faster. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking as I yanked the door open and threw myself inside. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into reverse, spinning it around on the narrow path. In the rear-view mirror, I saw them, standing at the tree line, their shapes blending with the shadows. They didn't follow, just stood there, watching as I sped away. I didn't stop driving until the sun rose, until the sight of other cars and open fields reassured me I was back in the world of the living. I told myself I'd imagined it, that isolation had played tricks on me. But that doesn't explain the scratches on my arms, or the faint handprints on the inside of the car window. I'll never know what those things were, or why they were waiting for me in that cabin. But I know this. Sometimes solitude isn't peaceful. It's a trap set for the living by something that doesn't belong in our world. And it almost had me. The crunch of gravel beneath the tires was the first thing that struck me. That, and the way the towering pines swallowed the light whole. The rental cabin looked like it had been sitting there for decades, nestled in the woods just outside of Asheville. It wasn't on the map. Not really. The listing on the site was vague. Rustic charm for nature lovers. And the directions were handwritten by the owner, complete with warnings about spotty GPS. It was my first night alone in years. No roommates, no partner, no one asking me for a thing. Just me, a couple of horror novels, and a weekend of silence. Heaven, right? I stepped out of the car, the late October air biting at my skin. The cabin was unassuming, wooden slats weathered gray, a roof that slumped slightly, and windows fogged with grime. It was perched on a slight hill, overlooking a lake that glittered under the sliver of moonlight. The first thing I noticed inside was the smell. Damp wood and something faintly sour, like milk left too long in the sun. I told myself it was normal for old cabins. The second thing was the silence. Not the comforting quiet I'd imagined, but an oppressive, heavy stillness. Even the frogs and crickets outside seemed muted. I unpacked quickly, shoving my bag into the only bedroom, before making myself a mug of cocoa. By 9 p.m., I was curled up in an old armchair, with a tattered blanket, book in hand. I thought I'd feel at peace. Instead, I felt watched. It was subtle at first, that weird sixth sense we all get sometimes. But then, halfway through a chapter, I caught it. The unmistakable sound of floorboards creaking. My eyes darted to the hallway. Empty. It's an old house, I mumbled to myself. Houses creak. It's nothing. But my gut churned, because the creak hadn't come from just anywhere. It was right outside the bedroom door. I closed the book, stood up, and walked over, trying to steady my breathing. The hallway stretched into darkness, broken only by the faint outline of the bedroom door. I stepped closer, flipping the light switch. Nothing happened. The bulb above me flickered and stayed dead. Another creak. Not the wood this time. This was behind me. The living room window. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. The chair I'd been sitting in was now turned slightly, facing the window. I hadn't touched it. I would have heard if it scraped across the floor. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response, just the wind rattling the trees outside. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was paranoia. Maybe I hadn't noticed the chair before. I locked the front door, checked the windows, and double-checked the back door before heading to bed. My skin prickled as I lay there in the dark, every creak and groan of the cabin amplified by the silence. But nothing happened. I drifted off eventually. I don't know what woke me. Maybe the cold, maybe the silence. But at 3:17 a.m., my eyes snapped open. I wasn't alone. There was breathing, slow, deliberate, not mine. I froze, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding in my ears. It was coming from the corner of the room. My phone was on the nightstand. Slowly, painstakingly, I turned my head, reaching for it. The glow of the screen lit up the room. There was nothing in the corner, but the bedroom door was open. I didn't leave it open. I bolted upright, grabbing the nearest thing, a lamp, and stumbled toward the door. The hallway stretched out in front of me, bathed in faint moonlight from the windows. The living room was silent. Still. Empty. Then I heard it. Faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the front porch. "Is someone there?" I whispered, my voice cracking. Tap, tap, tap. I tiptoed toward the front door, every step making my heart pound harder. The tapping grew louder as I approached. Through the frosted glass of the window, I could make out a faint shape, tall, unmoving. I swallowed hard, pressing my ear to the door. The tapping stopped. Then something hit the door. Hard. I jumped back as it rattled on its hinges. My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. I sprinted for the bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My hands trembled as I dialed 911, but there was no signal. Then I heard it. The scraping of metal against wood. The sound of the front door unlocking. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, backing up until I hit the far wall. The scraping stopped. Then silence. Minutes passed. Hours, maybe. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The first light of dawn crept through the window. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, the cabin was empty. But on the floor, carved deep into the wood, were two words: "Come back." I didn't, and I never will. I didn't leave that cabin with much. Just my bag, my car keys, and the gnawing certainty that I'd narrowly escaped something far beyond human. The moment my tires hit the main road, I didn't look back. Not at the woods, not at the cabin, and definitely not at the shadow I thought I saw standing in the porch window. I should have driven straight home, but there was this itch in the back of my mind. You know that feeling when something doesn't make sense, but you can't let it go? That cabin wasn't on any map. The directions were handwritten. The entire experience screamed wrong, and I needed to know why. So instead of heading back to my apartment, I drove straight into town. It was early morning by the time I parked at a diner, the kind of place where the locals hung out and knew everything about everyone. I walked in, still shaken, and ordered coffee, figuring out how to phrase the question without sounding like a lunatic. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes, refilled my cup and asked, "Rough night?" "You could say that," I replied. "I rented a cabin out past the lake. Thought I'd get some peace and quiet." She froze, her hand gripping the coffee pot. "Which cabin?" I described it. The hill, the lake, the porch. She set the pot down carefully and leaned in close. Sweetheart, that cabin's been empty for decades. My stomach turned. No, it hasn't. I stayed there last night. Found it online. Her expression darkened. You can't find that cabin online. Not anymore. Not since the fire. The diner suddenly felt colder. What fire? She glanced around, lowering her voice like she was afraid someone might hear. Years ago, a family rented that cabin. Husband, wife, little boy. They were city folk, out for a weekend in the woods. One night, something happened. Neighbors said they heard screaming, saw strange lights in the trees. By the time anyone got there, the place was gone, burned to ash. They never found the family, just the boy's teddy bear, charred and sitting on the front porch. I didn't know what to say. My mouth went dry, but it's still there. The cabin. I stayed there. She shook her head. Whatever you saw, it wasn't the cabin. At least, not the one that burned down. I pushed my coffee aside, suddenly nauseous. My mind raced back to last night. The chair that moved, the open door, the tapping, the message carved into the floorboards. Come back. I stumbled out of the diner without another word, fumbling with my car keys. The waitress didn't try to stop me, but as I pulled away, I saw her watching from the window, her face pale and tight with worry. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I got home, unpacked, and pretended it never happened. But things followed me. Little things at first. Shadows that didn't belong. The faint smell of sour milk in my apartment. Then, the tapping started again. Not on the porch this time, but on the inside of my closet door. Last night, I woke up at 3:17 a.m. There was a message scrawled on my bathroom mirror in wet streaks. You never left. This morning, I checked my emails. There's a new listing in my inbox. Same cabin, same handwritten directions. I deleted it, but the message won't go away. Every time I refresh, it's there, waiting, calling me back. I don't think I'll survive if I answer, but I'm not sure I'll survive if I don't. It started with a buzzing fluorescent light overhead, one of those that flicker in just the wrong rhythm to dig under your skin. I was midway through another night shift at the 24-hour gas station just off Route 17. You know the kind, reeking of old coffee, shelves lined with stale chips, and the perpetual hum of the ice cream freezer. That night, a fog rolled in thicker than I'd ever seen, swallowing up the world outside. The highway was nothing but black asphalt disappearing into a wall of gray. I hated working these shifts alone, but we'd just lost our only other night clerk. Guess it was my turn to hold down the fort until corporate hired someone new. It wasn't long before the first weird thing happened. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard it. A faint tapping, like fingernails drumming against glass. It came from the front window. At first, I thought it was just some bug, drawn to the neon open sign, but the sound was deliberate, methodical. Tap, tap, tap. I glanced up from the register, squinting through the fog-drenched pane. For a second, I thought I saw a shadow move. Hello? My voice cracked, embarrassing me even in my solitude. No answer. Steeling myself, I stepped out from behind the counter and moved closer to the glass. My breath fogged up the pane as I leaned in, searching for movement. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A hand. Pale, long fingers, almost skeletal, reached up and pressed against the outside of the glass. My heart leapt into my throat. I stumbled back, knocking over a rack of potato chips. The hand was gone. I fumbled for the phone, but of course, the damn landline had been out for days. Cell service out here? Forget it. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I convinced myself it was a prank. Some drunk weirdo messing around. but deep down, I knew better. I sat back behind the counter, trying to focus on restocking cigarettes and lottery tickets. For a while, it was quiet again, save for the buzz of that stupid light. Then the power flickered, plunging the store into a brief, suffocating darkness. When the light snapped back on, something wasn't right. One of the aisles, the one with the cheap candy, had been knocked over. Candy bars scattered across the floor. No way had that been like that before. I grabbed the flashlight we kept under the counter and stepped into the aisle. My palms were slick with sweat. "Is someone here?" I called out. My voice echoed against the empty shelves. No answer. Then, the freezer door slammed shut behind me. I whipped around, flashlight trembling in my hand. The freezer doors gleamed under the flickering light, their surfaces coated with condensation. Slowly, I moved toward them, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air seemed colder than it should have been, like the chill from the freezers had leaked into the entire store. My breath puffed out in short, nervous clouds. And then I saw it. One of the glass doors had fogged over, and written in the condensation, in long, jagged letters, were the words, "Look behind you." I froze. Every hair on my body stood on end. My throat felt tight, like something invisible was wrapping around it. I didn't want to turn. Every cell in my body screamed, "Don't turn around." But I did. The flashlight beam swept over the empty aisles, shaking as I scanned for anything out of place. There was nothing, just shelves of junk food and energy drinks. The fogged-up window near the entrance. The door I swore I had locked earlier, now standing slightly ajar. A tendril of fog, curling in like a lazy, creeping snake. And then, movement. At the edge of the beam, something darted between the shelves. Not walking, crawling. I backed up toward the counter, flashlight shaking. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. It appeared then, just for a second, peeking out from the corner of the pet food aisle. A face. But it wasn't a face. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched unnaturally tight over bone. The thing leaned out farther, its head cocking to one side like it was studying me. Then it scuttled out of sight, faster than anything human should move. I didn't think, I just ran. I sprinted toward the front door, slamming into the glass, fumbling with the lock. My fingers felt clumsy, the cold making them numb. Behind me, I heard it again, the tapping. But this time, it was everywhere. From the freezer doors, the windows, even the ceiling. Tap, tap, tap. The door finally gave way, and I stumbled out into the fog. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop running. The gas pumps were barely visible through the haze, their lights dim and flickering. That's when I heard the voice. "Where are you going?" It came from all directions, deep and rasping, like someone trying to talk through a throat full of gravel. I turned, flashlight beam slicing through the fog, and saw them. Dozens of them. Figures, crawling on all fours, their faceless heads tilted unnaturally. Their pale bodies seemed to shimmer, half solid, like they were caught between this world and another. They were closing in, surrounding me. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran for my car. The keys were in my pocket, but my hands were shaking so badly, it felt like it took an eternity to pull them out. The flashlight slipped from my grip and rolled away, its beam casting eerie shadows as it spun. I finally got the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and oppressive, and the creatures were there, circling the car. Their hands scraped against the glass, leaving smears of condensation behind. I turned the key in the ignition, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The engine sputtered once, twice, before roaring to life. The creatures froze, their heads snapping toward me in unison. For a moment, everything was silent. Then they screamed. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, high-pitched, guttural, like 1,000 voices crying out in agony. They lunged at the car, their hands slamming against the windows, their bodies writhing and twisting in impossible ways. I floored it. The tires squealed as I shot forward, the creatures scattering in the headlights. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove through the fog, the empty highway stretching out before me like a lifeline. Eventually, the fog lifted. The gas station disappeared in my rearview mirror, swallowed by the darkness. I quit the next day. I still don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I hear it. The tapping. And I can't help but wonder if they ever really let me go. The diner where I worked night shifts wasn't anything special. Just a run-of-the-mill greasy spoon sitting off a desolate highway in the middle of nowhere. Most nights were uneventful, serving truckers, wiping counters, and flipping through an ancient magazine to pass the hours. But that night was different. It started when the clock on the wall chimed midnight, a ritual so mundane that I usually didn't notice it. This time, though, the sound stretched on longer than it should have, like the chime was being dragged, distorted, pulled apart. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed and flickered, sending the room into brief bursts of darkness. I glanced toward the door, half hoping to see a customer walk in and break the eerie silence. Instead, the night outside seemed thicker than usual, the parking lot lights barely piercing the foggy darkness. Then the bell above the door jingled. No one had walked in. That's when I noticed the booth at the far end of the diner. It was occupied. I hadn't heard anyone come in. The man sitting there had his back to me. He wore a black jacket, the kind with a hood, though it was down. His dark hair was greasy and matted, and he sat perfectly still, staring out the window into the nothingness beyond. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't turn around. Great. Another weirdo. I grabbed the coffee pot and walked over, the sound of my sneakers sticking to the linoleum, filling the oppressive silence. "Coffee?" He turned his head slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were glassy, unblinking. "Do you ever wonder," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "what's watching when you're alone?" I froze, coffee pot trembling in my hand. What?" His lips curled into a grin, not a friendly one. Before I could respond, the lights in the diner flickered again. The man's grin widened, and when the lights steadied, the booth was empty. My stomach dropped. The coffee pot slipped from my fingers, shattering on the floor. And then, I heard it. A faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the kitchen. I stood frozen, staring at the shards of glass and the growing puddle of coffee at my feet. The tapping continued, echoing from the kitchen in the back. Each sound felt deliberate, as if whatever was making it wanted me to know it was there. My mind raced through rational explanations. Maybe it was a raccoon that got in through the back door. Maybe it was just the pipes. Maybe I was imagining things, but none of those thoughts made my legs stop trembling. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The diner was dead silent now, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and that god-awful tapping. I knew I had to check. As much as I wanted to grab my keys and bolt for my car, my feet betrayed me. I stepped cautiously toward the kitchen, every squeak of my sneakers against the linoleum, sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. The door to the kitchen was ajar, swinging slightly as if it had just been pushed open. The fluorescent light above it flickered erratically. "Anyone there?" I asked, louder this time. The tapping stopped. My breath hitched, and I clenched my fists to keep them from shaking. I stepped through the door and scanned the room. Everything was where it should be. The counters, the griddle, the industrial sink, nothing out of place. Until I saw the freezer door. It was cracked open. I knew I'd closed it. I was sure of it. The freezer was old, and it didn't stay cool unless it was properly latched. I edged closer, feeling the cold air snake out and brush against my skin. The tapping resumed, louder now, and it was definitely coming from inside the freezer. I reached out, my hand trembling as I grabbed the handle. Slowly, I pulled it open. The smell hit me first, metallic, rancid, and suffocating. Inside, the shelves were empty, save for a single object on the middle rack. It was a jar. The glass was smeared with something dark and viscous, and inside a mass of something pulsed faintly, as though alive. My stomach churned, but before I could back away, I heard a voice. "I told you," it whispered, low and guttural. I spun around, and there he was, the man from the booth, now standing in the doorway of the kitchen. His head tilted unnaturally to the side, and his grin was stretched wider than before, exposing teeth that were jagged and wrong. "You ever wonder what's watching?" he hissed, his voice distorted, like static on an old TV. I stumbled back, my foot slipping on the slick freezer floor. The jar fell from the shelf, shattering on the ground. The thing inside spilled out, a writhing, fleshy mass that began to grow. It unfurled long, spindly limbs that slapped against the walls, its surface glistening with a black, tar-like substance. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, as the creature turned toward me, its eyeless face twisted and shifted, its mouth opening impossibly wide to reveal rows of jagged teeth. "Run," the man said, his voice almost gleeful. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted out of the kitchen, through the diner, and into the foggy night. My car was the only thing I could think of, my sanctuary from whatever nightmare was unfolding behind me. As I reached the parking lot, I glanced back at the diner. The windows were dark, but I could see movement inside, shadows slithering across the walls, something too large to fit in that tiny kitchen. I jumped into my car, fumbled with the keys, and finally got the engine roaring. Tires screeching, I tore out of the lot, leaving the diner and its horrors behind. But as I sped down the empty highway, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror. The man was standing in the middle of the road, his grin still stretched wide, his hand raised in a slow, mocking wave. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I quit the diner the next day, but some nights, when the world is too quiet, I swear I can still hear the tapping. It started like any other night shift. The fluorescent lights in the back room of the gas station flickered with their usual irritating hum. I'd taken this job for the quiet. Somewhere I could collect my thoughts while dealing with the odd customer or two, mostly truckers and night owls. I'd been working there for 6 months without incident. That night, though, was different. It was the dead of winter, and a brutal windstorm had turned the streets into a graveyard of fallen branches and trash. I leaned against the counter, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, when the door chimed. A man walked in. His face was shrouded in the shadow of a hoodie, and he moved deliberately, too deliberate for someone who just wanted chips or smokes. Something about him immediately set my nerves on edge. He didn't look at me, didn't grab anything. He just wandered the aisles like he was searching for something. The cameras buzzed overhead. I glanced up at the monitors above the counter. I'd grown used to watching people on those screens. Most were harmless, predictable. But as I scanned the feeds, my stomach turned. There was a glitch in the camera. A second figure flickered into view behind the man. Tall, thin, its limbs too long for its body. Its head tilted unnaturally as it watched him. I blinked hard, thinking it was a software issue. But when I looked back up, the figure was gone. The man finally approached the counter, dropping a pack of gum and a small black notebook onto the surface. I rang him up, barely able to meet his eyes. "You working alone tonight?" he asked. It was a simple question, but the way he said it made my skin crawl. His voice was low, grating, like the sound of gravel under tires. "Yeah," I replied, regretting it instantly. He grinned, revealing teeth that were uneven and stained. He paid in cash, shoved the change into his pocket, and left without another word. But as the door swung shut, I noticed something he'd left behind. The notebook. It was small and weathered, its cover marked with a symbol I didn't recognize. My gut told me to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I flipped it open. The pages were filled with numbers, rows and rows of handwritten code that made no sense to me. Then at the bottom of one page, I saw something that made my breath hitch. "Do not stay until 3:17 a.m. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:48. For the next 29 minutes, I tried to shake it off as some kind of prank. But as the hour approached, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered, longer than usual. The cameras in the corner started to glitch again, showing static interspersed with brief, distorted images of the store. And then there were the noises, soft, guttural whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. At 3:16, the power went out completely. The store plunged into darkness, save for the faint blinking glow of the exit sign. And then the door chimed again. The chime echoed unnaturally in the silent store. My stomach knotted as the air around me turned cold, like I'd stepped into a meat locker. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to scan the darkness. The aisles stretched out like corridors to nowhere, and the shadows seemed to writhe at the edges of the beam. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, trembling. No answer. The chime came again. The door hadn't opened. It was still shut, but the sound repeated over and over, like someone was walking in and out, or something was toying with me. Then a sound from the back room, a dragging noise, heavy and wet, like a sack of meat being pulled across the floor. My body froze, my breathing shallow. The noise stopped, replaced by a faint clicking sound, like fingernails tapping glass. I slowly aimed my flashlight toward the office door. It creaked open, just a crack, revealing only darkness within. "Who's there?" I whispered, barely audible even to myself. A voice answered, low and distorted. "You should have left." I nearly dropped my phone. The voice came from everywhere, above me, behind me, inside me. I took a step back, my heel catching the edge of the counter. That's when I saw it on the cameras. The monitors, somehow still active despite the power outage, showed the store from every angle, and in every feed, it was there. The thing I'd seen earlier, flickering like a broken signal. It stood impossibly tall, its head brushing the ceiling. Its body was grotesquely elongated, with limbs that bent in ways no humans should. Its face was nothing but a void, darker than the surrounding shadows. It moved slowly down the aisle, its steps silent but deliberate, coming straight toward me. I spun around, shining my light. Nothing was there. Yet on the cameras, it was only feet away. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and I bolted for the back door. The dragging sound started again, louder now, as if it were right behind me. I reached the door and shoved it open, stumbling into the freezing night air. The parking lot was empty, the wind howling through the trees. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. Fumbling with the keys, I started the engine and peeled out of the lot. The rear-view mirror taunted me. I couldn't bring myself to look at it, terrified of what I might see. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat in my living room, shaking. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a text from an unknown number. "You forgot the notebook." My blood ran cold. I didn't respond, didn't sleep, didn't even move for the rest of the night. When morning came, I called my manager and quit. I never went back to that gas station. Weeks later, I saw a news report. A night shift worker at the same gas station had gone missing. The police found the store in disarray, the back room smeared with streaks of something unidentifiable. They never found the worker, or any evidence of who or what had been there. I've kept the story to myself all these years, but every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I hear it again. That chime. And I know it hasn't forgotten. I was deep in the Arizona desert, driving my rig on a night run. I don't usually take these kinds of shifts, but the extra pay was too good to pass up. The load was nothing unusual. Pallets of canned food heading to some supermarket in California. Just me, my truck, and miles of empty road. But this wasn't just any night. The moon hung low and bloated, casting the kind of pale light that makes shadows seem alive. About 2 hours past midnight, I was on a stretch of Route 95, a desolate ribbon of asphalt with nothing but sand and scrub for company. That's when I saw them. Flickering headlights up ahead, faint and wavering, like a mirage. A car stranded in the middle of nowhere. I slowed down. Out here, leaving someone stranded could mean death. My headlights washed over the scene as I pulled closer. An old sedan, doors open, hazard lights blinking weakly. No sign of anyone around. I parked my rig a safe distance away and grabbed my flashlight. My gut was already doing that uneasy twist, but I couldn't just leave without checking. "Hello?" I called, my voice swallowed by the desert night. No answer. I walked toward the car, shining my light into the driver's seat. Empty. The passenger's side? Empty. The trunk was closed, but the whole thing reeked of abandonment. Then I saw it. Drag marks in the dirt, leading away from the car and into the scrubland. They weren't deep, but they were fresh. 2 parallel lines, like something, or someone, had been pulled away. I thought about getting back in my truck and calling it in, but something compelled me to follow. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was stupidity. Probably both. The tracks led me about 200 yards off the road to a shallow ravine. The flashlight beam danced over the rocks and sand, catching something glinting below. A piece of fabric, red, torn, and snagged on a branch. My heart was hammering now, every survival instinct screaming at me to leave. Then I heard it. A low guttural sound, almost like breathing, but wrong. Like a deep, wet rasp that echoed faintly in the stillness. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The sound came again, closer this time. "Is someone out there?" I called, barely managing to keep the quiver out of my voice. No response. I edged closer to the edge of the ravine, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a person, crouched low to the ground. But as my light hit it, the shape flinched, its body twisted in ways no human could manage. Its skin was pale and stretched too tightly over a skeletal frame. Long arms, almost insect-like, ended in hands with fingers that were too long. And the eyes, those black sunken pits, locked onto mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it let out a sound, a shriek that pierced the night, so high and sharp it felt like it was slicing through my skull. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. Whatever it was, I didn't want to know if it was following me. My feet pounded the sand as I sprinted back to the truck, my lungs burning and heart threatening to burst out of my chest. I reached the rig, scrambled into the cab, and locked the doors. My hands fumbled for the keys, but they slipped from my sweaty fingers. The shriek came again, closer this time, and I could swear I heard the sound of something scraping against metal. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the truck into gear. Gravel sprayed as I tore back onto the highway, my eyes darting between the road and the side mirrors. For a few minutes, all I could hear was the hum of the engine and the pounding of my heart. Then, in the distance, the figure appeared in my headlights again. It wasn't on the road this time. It was perched on the rocks just beyond the shoulder, crouched and watching as I sped past. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, my nerves frayed and hands still shaking. I told the gas station attendant about the abandoned car, left a call for the sheriff, and got back in the truck. I never found out what happened to whoever was in that sedan. I didn't want to know. But sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm out on the road, I still think about those eyes in the dark, and I wonder if they're out there, watching, waiting for the next trucker to pull over. It's been years since that night, and I've tried to push it out of my mind. I've driven thousands of miles, hauled countless loads, and seen my fair share of strange things on the road. But nothing has ever come close to that night on Route 95. I did my best to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was a wild animal, something deformed or injured, though deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The way it moved, the way it watched me, it was no animal, and certainly not human. About a month after the incident, I heard something on the radio that made my stomach churn. A local news station was covering the disappearance of a young couple who had been traveling through the desert. I was deep in the Arizona desert, driving my rig on a night run. I don't usually take these kinds of shifts, but the extra pay was too good to pass up. The load was nothing unusual, pallets of canned food heading to some supermarket in California. Just me, my truck, and miles of empty road. But this wasn't just any night. The moon hung low and bloated, casting the kind of pale light that makes shadows seem alive. About 2 hours past midnight, I was on a stretch of Route 95, a desolate ribbon of asphalt with nothing but sand and scrub for company. That's when I saw them, flickering headlights up ahead, faint and wavering, like a mirage. A car stranded in the middle of nowhere. I slowed down. Out here, leaving someone stranded could mean death. My headlights washed over the scene as I pulled closer. An old sedan, doors open, hazard lights blinking weakly. No sign of anyone around. I parked my rig a safe distance away and grabbed my flashlight. My gut was already doing that uneasy twist, but I couldn't just leave without checking. "Hello?" I called, my voice swallowed by the desert night. No answer. I walked toward the car, shining my light into the driver's seat. Empty. The passenger side? Empty. The trunk was closed, but the whole thing reeked of abandonment. Then I saw it. Drag marks in the dirt, leading away from the car and into the scrubland. They weren't deep, but they were fresh. 2 parallel lines, like something, or someone, had been pulled away. I thought about getting back in my truck and calling it in, but something compelled me to follow. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was stupidity, probably both. The tracks led me about 200 yards off the road to a shallow ravine. The flashlight beam danced over the rocks and sand, catching something glinting below. A piece of fabric, red, torn, and snagged on a branch. My heart was hammering now. every survival instinct screaming at me to leave. Then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like breathing, but wrong, like a deep, wet rasp that echoed faintly in the stillness. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The sound came again, closer this time. "Is someone out there?" I called, barely managing to keep the quiver out of my voice. No response. I edged closer to the edge of the ravine, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a person, crouched low to the ground. But as my light hit it, the shape flinched. Its body twisted in ways no human could manage. Its skin was pale and stretched too tightly over a skeletal frame. Long arms, almost insect-like, ended in hands with fingers that were too long. And the eyes, those black sunken pits, locked onto mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it let out a sound, a shriek that pierced the night, so high and sharp it felt like it was slicing through my skull. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. Whatever it was, I didn't want to know if it was following me. My feet pounded the sand as I sprinted back to the truck, my lungs burning and heart threatening to burst out of my chest. I reached the rig, scrambled into the cab, and locked the doors. My hands fumbled for the keys, but they slipped from my sweaty fingers. The shriek came again, closer this time, and I could swear I heard the sound of something scraping against metal. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the truck into gear. Gravel sprayed as I tore back onto the highway, my eyes darting between the road and the side mirrors. For a few minutes, all I could hear was the hum of the engine and the pounding of my heart. Then, in the distance, the figure appeared in my headlights again. It wasn't on the road this time. It was perched on the rocks just beyond the shoulder, crouched and watching as I sped past. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, my nerves frayed and hands still shaking. I told the gas station attendant about the abandoned car, left a call for the sheriff, and got back in the truck. I never found out what happened to whoever was in that sedan. I didn't want to know. But sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm out on the road, I still think about those eyes in the dark, and I wonder if they're out there, watching, waiting for the next trucker to pull over. It's been years since that night, and I've tried to push it out of my mind. I've driven thousands of miles, hauled countless loads, and seen my fair share of strange things on the road. But nothing has ever come close to that night on Route 95. I did my best to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was a wild animal, something deformed or injured, though deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The way it moved, the way it watched me, it was no animal, and certainly not human. About a month after the incident, I heard something on the radio that made my stomach churn. A local news station was covering the disappearance of a young couple who had been traveling through the desert. It started with a hiss, not the sound a snake makes, but the distinct, sharp hiss of air escaping, like a tire losing its life on a lonely stretch of highway. I was 2 hours into my haul, somewhere between Amarillo and the middle of nowhere, when my right front tire decided it had had enough. Truckers call this route the dead strip. A lot of things die here. Tires, trucks, sometimes even people. But what most don't know is that it's not just the name. This road has a reputation for weirdness. I didn't believe the stories until I became one of them. I pulled the rig over at mile marker 233, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped into the cold embrace of the desert night. The highway stretched on in both directions, like an eternal black ribbon, and the stars above glared down, mocking my solitude. The tire was, as I suspected, toast. I cursed under my breath, glancing down the empty road. Not a single pair of headlights for miles. I had no choice. I needed to get the spare. That's when I heard it. A low, whispering hum. It wasn't the wind or the distant call of coyotes. It was wrong. I froze. The flashlight beam flickered for a moment, then steadied. The sound grew louder, circling me, and for a second I swore I felt a breath, hot and rancid, against the back of my neck. I whipped around, my heart pounding like a hammer in my chest, but there was nothing. Just my truck, the desert, and the endless stretch of highway. My hand hovered over the flashlight switch, itching to turn it off and dive back into the cab. But something, call it stupid curiosity, or the need to prove I wasn't losing my mind, kept me outside. That's when I saw it. In the distance, maybe 50 yards off the road, there was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its limbs seemed stretched, like someone had taken a person and pulled at the edges. Its head was tilted at an angle, and though it was too far away to see its face, I knew it was staring at me. I don't remember deciding to move, but suddenly, I was back in the cab, locking the doors and fumbling to start the engine. My hands were trembling, and the key slipped in the ignition twice before I finally got it right. The truck roared to life, but as I glanced at the side mirror, my blood turned to ice. The thing was closer. I don't know how it moved without making a sound, but it was there, just 10 feet from the rear trailer. Its head tilted again, and for the briefest second, I saw its eyes reflected in the mirror. 2 pale orbs, hollow and endless. I slammed on the gas. The truck groaned under the sudden pressure, but it lurched forward, tires screaming against the asphalt. The thing didn't follow, at least not that I could see. For miles, I drove like a bat out of hell, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. But the humming didn't stop. It was inside the cab now, faint but persistent, like a song stuck on the edge of your mind. I reached a rest stop near mile marker 245, desperate to shake the unease clinging to my skin. There was another rig parked there, and the sight of a fellow trucker felt like salvation. I pulled in, parked, and climbed out, eager to share my story and prove to myself that I wasn't going insane. The other driver was sitting on the hood of his truck, smoking a cigarette. His face was shadowed under a baseball cap, but he gave me a nod as I approached. "You all right, man?" he asked, his voice rough but calm. I hesitated. "Yeah. Just had a weird night. You seen anything strange around here?" He took a long drag of his cigarette, the ember glowing like a dying star. "Strange how?" I opened my mouth to explain, but then I saw it. The reflection in the window of his cab. The thing was there, standing just behind him, its face inches from his shoulder, its mouth twisted into a grin that stretched far too wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. "Get in your truck," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What?" "Get in your truck," I shouted this time, grabbing his arm and yanking him towards the door. He dropped the cigarette, cursing, but when he turned to see what I was looking at, the color drained from his face. We didn't speak as we climbed into our respective cabs and sped away from the rest stop. The thing didn't follow, but the humming stayed with me, growing louder with every mile. I didn't stop again until I reached the truck stop at the edge of the state line. The other driver pulled in beside me, and we both sat there in silence, engines idling. Finally, he rolled down his window and said, "You're not crazy. I've seen it before." "What is it?" I asked, my voice shaking. He just shook his head. "Don't know. Don't want to know. But it's tied to that stretch of highway. Once you see it, you don't go back." That was the last thing he said before he pulled out and disappeared into the night. As for me, I still drive, but I avoid mile marker 233 like my life depends on it. Because it does. I tried to forget. For weeks after that night, I avoided the dead strip like the plague, took longer routes, ate up more fuel, and lost time on deliveries. Didn't care. Safety wasn't a cost. It was survival. But life's funny like that. It doesn't care about your plans. Dispatch gave me a new assignment, a cross-country haul to Phoenix with a tight deadline. The route? Straight through the dead strip. I argued, even considered quitting. But when you've got bills stacking up and a truck that's practically held together by duct tape and prayers, choices start looking less like choices and more like traps. So, there I was, rumbling down that cursed stretch of asphalt once again. The radio was off, the windows sealed tight, and every muscle in my body was coiled like a spring. The hum didn't start right away. In fact, the first 50 miles passed in relative peace. But as soon as I crossed the line into the dead strip, it returned. A faint vibration, just below the edge of hearing, like a swarm of invisible insects crawling inside my skull. I clenched the wheel, my eyes darting between the road and the mirrors. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, a constant reminder of my own fragility. Mile marker, 230 passed, then 231. By the time 233 came into view, I was gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. That's when I saw it. This time, it wasn't just the tall, stretched figure. No, there were 3 of them, and they weren't waiting by the roadside. They were in the middle of the highway, standing shoulder to shoulder, their hollow eyes fixed on me. Not again, I muttered, slamming my foot on the brakes. The rig screeched in protest, the trailer swaying dangerously as the tires struggled to grip the pavement. The truck came to a halt just feet from the figures, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then they moved, their heads tilted in unison, grotesquely jerking to the side, as if studying me. One stepped closer, its elongated limbs bending at impossible angles. I fumbled for the gear shift, desperate to reverse, but before I could react, it reached out and touched the hood of my truck. The engine died instantly. The lights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. "Come on," I whispered, turning the key in the ignition. Nothing, not even a click. The hum was deafening now, filling the cab with a suffocating pressure. My breath came in shallow gasps as the figures circled the truck, their movements slow and deliberate. One of them climbed onto the hood, its pale face inches from the windshield. Its mouth moved, but the words were lost in the overwhelming hum. It raised a skeletal hand and pressed it against the glass, leaving behind a smear of dark, oily residue. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I grabbed the flashlight from the seat beside me and shone it directly into its face. The reaction was immediate. It recoiled with a shriek that pierced through the hum, a sound so high-pitched it made my teeth ache. The others froze, their hollow eyes glaring at the light. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed the crowbar I kept under the seat, kicked the driver's door open, and bolted into the night. The desert air was cold and biting, but adrenaline kept me moving. I didn't know where I was going, just away. Behind me, the hum grew louder, mingling with guttural cries that sent shivers down my spine. I ran until my lungs burned, my boots crunching against the gravel. In the distance, I saw a faint glow, a rest stop, salvation. My legs screamed in protest, but I forced myself to keep going, the hum closing in like a storm. When I reached the rest stop, I collapsed against the door, pounding on it with what little strength I had left. A burly man in a trucker cap opened it, his eyes widening at the sight of me. "They're coming," I gasped, dragging myself inside. He didn't ask questions. He bolted the door and grabbed a shotgun from behind the counter. The hum was right outside now, vibrating through the walls. The man nodded to a hatch in the floor. "Basement," he said. "Go." I didn't argue. I scrambled down the ladder, the man following close behind. We sat in the dark, listening to the sound of something or somethings scraping against the walls above. The hum grew fainter, then stopped altogether. Hours passed before we dared to surface. The rest stop was intact, but my truck was gone. Not a trace of it remained. The man handed me his phone, and I called dispatch. When they found me, they said there was no record of my truck ever being there. No tire tracks, no debris, nothing. Just an empty stretch of highway. I haven't driven the dead strip since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear that hum, and I know they're still out there waiting for me. I've been a trucker for 15 years, long haul, coast to coast. It's a job for someone who doesn't mind solitude and long hours of highway hypnosis. But last winter, in a storm-cloaked stretch of Wyoming, I learned solitude has its limits. It began just outside Cheyenne, where a whiteout hit with no warning. 1 second I was cruising along I-80, and the next, visibility dropped to 0. Snow fell so heavily, it seemed the air itself had turned to ice. I pulled into a truck stop, hoping to wait it out. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of rigs idling, their lights glowing faintly through the snow. I parked near the far edge of the lot, away from the others. I don't like idle chatter. Inside the truck stop, the diner was closed. The lights buzzed dimly overhead. A lone cashier stood behind the counter, looking as tired as I felt. He gave me a nod, but didn't say a word. I grabbed a coffee from a machine older than me and headed back to my rig. That's when I saw it. Parked near the lot's entrance was a truck I hadn't noticed before. It was an old cab over, beat to hell, with its hood propped open. Black paint flaked off its sides like ash, and a rusted emblem I couldn't make out dangled from the grill. But it wasn't the truck that made my stomach knot. It was the driver. The man stood motionless in the blizzard, facing the storm as though he didn't feel the cold. He was tall, skeletal, with a tattered trench coat whipping around him. His face was pale, gaunt, and I swear to God, his eyes glowed faintly blue. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't even flinch as the wind howled past. "Hell of a night, huh?" I called out, hoping to break the tension. Nothing. He just stood there, staring into the storm. I shook it off. Maybe he was waiting for a tow or just lost in thought. Either way, I climbed back into my rig and locked the doors. The cab was freezing, but the coffee warmed me up enough to consider getting some rest. That's when the CB crackled to life. "Breaker 19, you got ears on?" The voice was a rasp, dry and sharp, like old paper tearing. I grabbed the mic. "This is Redbird. Who's out there?" Silence. Static hissed, low and menacing. Then the voice came back, softer now, almost a whisper. "You shouldn't have stopped." The radio went dead. I scanned the lot through my mirrors. The snow was falling even harder, and I couldn't see more than a few feet past my trailer. But I could feel something, an unease creeping up my spine like frostbite. Then I heard it, a knock on my passenger door. I froze. The mirrors showed nothing, no shadow, no shape, just swirling snow. My hand moved to the glove box where I kept my knife. Slowly, I leaned toward the window and peered out. Nothing. Just white. The knock came again, louder this time. It wasn't frantic, like someone seeking help. It was deliberate, measured. I flicked on the dome light and rolled down the window just enough to yell through. "Who's there?" Silence. Then faintly, over the storm's wail, I heard laughter. Low, guttural, and wrong, like something trying to mimic a human voice, but failing. I slammed the window shut, locked it, and fired up the engine. I didn't care about the storm anymore. I needed to get out of there. As I shifted into gear, the CB came to life again. The same voice. You can't outrun it. I threw the mic down and floored it. My tires spun in the ice, struggling for traction, but I managed to lurch forward. As I pulled onto the highway, I glanced in my mirror. The skeletal man was standing at the edge of the lot, his glowing eyes fixed on me. And he wasn't alone. Behind him, barely visible in the storm, were more figures. Dozens of them, all standing motionless, their eyes the same eerie blue. I didn't stop driving for 8 hours straight. By the time I reached Salt Lake City, the storm had passed and the sun was rising. But the memory of those figures, the man's glowing eyes, and that laugh, they haunt me still. And here's the worst part. Every now and then, on a lonely stretch of road, my CB crackles to life, and that same voice, dry and sharp, whispers, "You can't outrun it." Weeks passed, but I couldn't shake what happened in Wyoming. I chalked it up to exhaustion, maybe even hallucinations. Trucking isn't exactly a career that fosters mental health, but deep down, I knew better. Something had changed. Something was following me. The first real clue came during a late-night haul through Nebraska. I'd been parked at a rest area, nodding off in the sleeper cab. My CB radio crackled to life, and I tensed, bracing for the voice. But instead, I heard static. At first. Then it shifted. Through the static, I heard faint words, fragmented but clear enough to make my skin crawl. "Redbird, coming for you." The radio fell silent again, but the damage was done. I barely slept that night. When dawn broke, I pushed my rig harder than ever, barreling through miles of empty road just to feel the sun's warmth on my face. It didn't help. The sightings started after that. I'd see headlights in my mirrors late at night, far off but unwavering. They'd stay with me for hours, always the same distance behind no matter how fast or slow I drove. When I pulled off the highway, the lights would vanish, but as soon as I returned to the road, they'd reappear. One night, outside of Amarillo, I stopped at a diner to calm my nerves. The place was almost empty, just a couple of locals and a waitress who looked like she hadn't slept in years. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed a figure through the window, standing by the edge of the parking lot. It was him, the skeletal man from the Wyoming truck stop. His glowing eyes bored into me, even through the glass. I shot up, knocking over my mug, and ran outside. But by the time I reached the lot, he was gone. Just snow and silence remained. I didn't go back inside. I climbed into my rig and drove. The final encounter came a week later. I was heading through the Mojave Desert, the vast emptiness a cruel mirror to the void growing in my mind. It was past midnight, and the road stretched endlessly ahead, bathed in the pale glow of my headlights. The CB radio crackled. This time, the voice was clear. "Redbird, pull over. It's time." I ignored it, gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. My heart pounded, but I kept my foot on the gas. "Pull over." The command came again, louder, more insistent. The temperature in the cab dropped suddenly, my breath fogging the windshield. Then, from the darkness ahead, I saw them. Figures lining both sides of the highway. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all glowing faintly in the moonlight. The skeletal man stood in the center of the road, directly in my path. I screamed and hit the brakes. The rig shuddered to a stop just feet from him. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared with those cold, glowing eyes. The figures on the roadside began to move. Slowly they approached, their faces obscured, but their shapes unmistakably human, or what used to be human. They encircled the truck, tapping on the windows, their hands leaving frost on the glass. Then the skeletal man raised a hand. The engine died. I was trapped. "Get out," the voice rasped through the CB, but now it was coming from everywhere. Inside the cab, outside, even from within my own head. I reached for my knife, but my hand wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, my body betraying me as the skeletal man climbed onto the hood of the truck. His face was inches from mine, separated only by the thin layer of glass. "Get out," he whispered again. And then, in a final act of defiance, I closed my eyes. If this was how it ended, I didn't want to see it. But the sound I expected, the shattering of glass, the tearing of metal, never came. When I opened my eyes, the figures were gone. The skeletal man, the glowing eyes, all of it. The engine roared to life on its own, and the CB was silent. I drove until dawn, pulling into a truck stop just as the sun crested the horizon. The parking lot was bustling, full of life. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope, but as I climbed down from the cab, I saw something on the hood. Scratched into the paint, deep and jagged, were 3 words: "You can't outrun." I still drive, but I don't go west anymore. I don't listen to the CB at night, and every now and then, when the snow falls heavy, I see glowing eyes in my rearview mirror, waiting, watching. Because they're right, you can't outrun it. It was 2:47 a.m. when the call came through my police radio. A disturbance near the old Bainsworth facility, a place that had been shut down for decades. This was one of those calls you dreaded, because it was a long drive into the outskirts. And honestly, that facility gave every cop on the force the creeps. Dispatch mentioned it was a possible trespasser, but there was something in their tone, a hesitation that made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just another bored teenager trying to impress their friends by breaking into a creepy building, but I didn't really believe it. Something felt off. When I arrived, the building loomed in the darkness, its jagged roofline silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon. My flashlight barely pierced the heavy mist curling around the grounds. The facility had this eerie, alive quality, like it was watching me. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel. That's when I noticed it. The silence. No wind, no animals, not even the distant hum of traffic. Just silence so thick it pressed against my eardrums. I scanned the area. The front gate was ajar, the padlock hanging loosely from its chain. "Probably kids," I muttered under my breath, though I wasn't convinced. As I stepped through the gate, my radio crackled, static, followed by faint whispers. I froze. "Dispatch, you copy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. No reply. Just more static, and what sounded like faint breathing. I gripped my flashlight tighter and moved toward the main building. The old brick walls were covered in graffiti, but there were no signs of recent activity. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Probably a raccoon, or maybe the wind nudged the gate open. Then I saw it. A faint glow coming from one of the upper windows. A flickering, unnatural light, like an old projector reel playing on a loop. My stomach churned. I should have called for backup, but pride got the better of me. Probably just squatters, I told myself, though my gut was screaming otherwise. I entered the building. The air inside was suffocating, thick with the stench of mildew and something metallic, like blood. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of the abandoned equipment, rusted conveyor belts, shattered glass, and stacks of rotting wooden crates. Then I heard it. Footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate. My breath hitched as I strained to listen. "Police!" I called out. My voice echoed back at me, but there was no response. The footsteps stopped, I crept up the staircase, each step groaning under my weight. The closer I got to the second floor, the stronger that metallic smell became. The flickering light spilled out into the hallway, casting long, jittery shadows. When I reached the landing, I saw the source of the light, an old CRT television, its screen crackling with static. In front of it was a chair, and slumped in that chair was a figure. "Police," I repeated, my voice cracking. No response. I edged closer, and the figure came into focus. It was a man, his face pale and slack, eyes wide open but unseeing. His mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile, and carved into his chest was a single word: "Watch." I stumbled back, my stomach lurching. That's when I heard the footsteps again. Not above me this time, but behind me. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. I whipped around, flashlight slicing through the darkness, but there was no one there. "Enough of this," I muttered, backing toward the staircase. That's when the television changed. The static morphed into an image, a live feed. It was me, standing in that hallway, flashlight trembling in my hand. My blood ran cold as I saw a figure creeping up behind me on the screen. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The screen flickered again, and now it showed the man in the chair. Only, he wasn't slumped anymore. His head was tilted toward the camera, his dead eyes staring directly at me. And then he smiled. The television cut to black. I ran. Down the stairs, through the front doors, and straight to my car. As I fumbled with the keys, I glanced back at the building. Every window on the second floor was glowing now, figures silhouetted in each one. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, gravel spraying in my wake. When I got back to the station, I tried to file my report, but no one would believe me. The Bainsworth facility had supposedly been demolished a year ago. But I know what I saw, and I haven't slept a full night since. I tried to forget that night at Bainsworth. I really did. I kept telling myself it was stress, lack of sleep, or some elaborate prank played by God knows who. But the images lingered. Those windows glowing with silhouettes, the man in the chair grinning at me through the screen, and worst of all, the word carved into his chest: "Watch." For weeks, nothing happened. I kept my head down, buried myself in paperwork, and avoided night shifts whenever possible. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Whatever I encountered that night wasn't something you just walked away from. Then, one evening, I got home and found a package on my doorstep. No return address, just a plain cardboard box sealed with packing tape. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single VHS tape, unmarked and old. My heart sank. I didn't even own a VCR, but my neighbor, Mr. Carter, was an antique enthusiast, so I borrowed his. As I set it up, every nerve in my body screamed not to press play. But I did. The screen flickered to life, and the grainy footage showed a familiar hallway, the second floor of the Bainsworth facility. The camera was moving, shaky, as if it were being carried. The angle turned, and there I was, standing in that hallway, flashlight trembling. The tape played exactly what I had experienced that night. Me finding the man in the chair, the flickering TV, the footsteps behind me. But then, it showed something new. After I ran, the camera turned back to the man in the chair. He slowly rose, his head lolling to one side. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. He walked toward the camera, his empty eyes locked on the lens. He reached out, and the screen went black. I yanked the tape out and smashed it against the floor. My heart was pounding, and sweat dripped down my face. That was when I heard the knock at the door. It was soft at first, just a gentle tap, tap, tap. but it grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed my service weapon and approached the door, my hands shaking. "Who's there?" I shouted, but there was no response. The knocking stopped. I opened the door, and no one was there. Just the empty street and the faint hum of distant traffic. But as I stepped out onto the porch, I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. My skin crawled, and I scanned the area, but nothing seemed out of place. When I turned to go back inside, I froze. There, on my living room wall, was a message written in what looked like ash. "You watched. Now they watch." My breath hitched, and my vision blurred. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door, determined to leave town, to put as much distance between myself and whatever was happening as possible. But as I drove, the streetlights flickered and died one by one in my rearview mirror. Then the static started. It wasn't on the radio or my phone. It was in my head. A low, droning hum that grew louder and louder until it felt like my skull would split. I pulled over, gripping the sides of my head, and that's when I saw it. In the rearview mirror, glowing faintly in the darkness, was the silhouette of a figure standing in the middle of the road. I turned, but no one was there. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer. Panic set in, and I slammed on the gas. My tires screeched as I sped down the empty road, but no matter how fast I went, the figure in the mirror grew closer. It wasn't walking, it wasn't running, it was just there, always a few steps closer every time I blinked. When I couldn't take it anymore, I veered off the road into a gas station parking lot. The place was brightly lit, and I hoped the light would keep whatever it was at bay. But as I stumbled out of the car, the gas station attendant stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "You okay, officer?" he asked, his voice wary. I glanced back at my car. The rear window was shattered, the back seat empty except for a single ash-blackened chair. I don't remember much after that. Just the attendant calling an ambulance, the blaring sirens, and me trying to explain what had happened. They said it was exhaustion, maybe a stress-induced hallucination. They didn't see the chair, and when I went back later, it was gone. But I know what I saw, and I know this isn't over. Even now, as I write this, I can feel it. That same sensation I felt outside my house. The same eyes watching me. They're always watching. And now, so are you. When you work for the police long enough, you learn that most routine calls aren't routine at all. The one I got at 2:37 a.m. on a cold November night was no different. The dispatcher sounded shaken, which was rare for her. She told me there was a disturbance at an old warehouse just outside the city. No further details, just static, like the signal didn't want me to know more. I grabbed my coat, badge, and gun and hit the road. The warehouse was isolated, one of those places that had outlived its usefulness long before I was born. As I approached, I felt a chill creep up my spine, colder than the frost forming on my windshield. Something was off. The building's silhouette loomed against the cloudy sky, its windows glowing faintly with a flickering light. There wasn't supposed to be anyone there. As I pulled into the gravel lot, I noticed a patrol car already parked out front. No officer in sight. The driver's side door was wide open, the radio crackling faintly with garbled static. My instinct told me to call for backup, but before I could grab the radio, I saw movement. A shadow slipping behind one of the loading docks. I didn't want to go in alone, but something inside me whispered that waiting might make things worse. I stepped out of my car, flashlight and gun drawn. The wind howled through the cracked windows and broke in steel beams of the warehouse. Every step I took echoed louder than it should have, like the place was amplifying my presence. The loading dock was empty, just an oil drum tipped over and some discarded chains. Then I heard it. A faint hum, like machinery coming to life deep inside the building. I followed the sound. The main entrance was unlocked. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt heavier, almost alive. The smell of mildew and rust hit me hard, but there was something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like copper. Blood. My heartbeat quickened as I shone my flashlight across the darkened space. Empty crates, stacks of abandoned equipment. And then, in the far corner, a pool of something thick and black glistened under the weak light from a broken bulb. I crouched next to the badge, my flashlight trembling slightly. The black liquid was blood, partially dried, streaking toward the warehouse's interior like someone had been dragged. A sick feeling coiled in my stomach, but I forced myself to follow the trail. The hum I'd heard earlier grew louder. It wasn't just machinery. It was layered, almost melodic, like voices blending together into something unnatural. Every step forward felt like stepping into quicksand, but I couldn't stop. Not now. The trail ended at a large steel door, rusted shut but slightly ajar. I pushed it open with the barrel of my gun, and it creaked like it hadn't been moved in decades. Inside was a massive room filled with a strange pulsating glow. The light came from a series of monitors stacked haphazardly on top of each other, showing grainy black and white footage. My breath caught in my throat when I realized what I was seeing. Each monitor displayed a different angle of the warehouse. One showed the loading dock I'd just come from. Another showed the gravel lot where my car sat, empty, except for my vehicle. Then one screen caught my attention. It showed the very room I was standing in. The camera was positioned high above, giving me a perfect bird's-eye view of myself. And behind me, a shadow moved. I spun around, gun raised, but there was nothing there. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned back to the monitors. Now, every screen displayed the same thing. A man standing in the shadows, his face obscured, his body unnaturally tall and thin. He wasn't moving, but I could feel his gaze burning through the cameras. Then the hum grew louder, almost deafening, and the lights flickered. "Help," a voice whispered, barely audible over the sound. I whirled around again, flashlight sweeping the room. No one. "Help me!" The voice exploded through the room, and suddenly, the monitors went black, every screen at once. My flashlight flickered as the temperature dropped sharply. The air felt wrong, like I was standing in the middle of a storm, though nothing around me moved. And then, out of the darkness, came a sound I'll never forget. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy. They echoed from the far side of the room, but when I shone my light there, nothing was visible. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right behind me. I turned and fired. The muzzle flash lit up the room for a split second, revealing nothing but empty air. The sound ricocheted off the walls, deafening in the silence that followed. And then I saw it. Not behind me, but on one of the monitors that had flickered back to life. A man, tall and distorted, his features blurred like a smear on glass, standing right in front of me on the screen. But in real life, the room was empty. I ran. I didn't stop to think, didn't stop to breathe, just bolted through the door and down the hallway, retracing my steps toward the exit. The hum was everywhere now, vibrating through my chest like it was alive. I reached the loading dock, but the door slammed shut in front of me with a force that rattled my teeth. "No," I whispered, yanking at the handle. It didn't budge. Behind me, the footsteps returned faster now, closing the distance. I spun around, ready to face whatever was coming, but the warehouse was empty. Still, I felt it. A presence heavy and suffocating, pressing down on me. My vision blurred, and my legs buckled as the hum reached an unbearable pitch. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The air went still. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint chirp of my radio. I fumbled for it with shaking hands. "Officer down," I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. "Back up." Before I could finish, the loading dock door creaked open on its own. Cold air rushed in, and I didn't hesitate. I stumbled out into the night, gasping for air like I'd been underwater. My patrol car was still there, untouched, but the other vehicle was gone. No sign of the other officer. No sign of anything at all. I drove straight to the station and filed my report, but no one believed me. The warehouse was investigated the next morning. It was empty. No monitors, no blood, no evidence that anything had ever happened. Even the badge I found was gone. But I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't over. That night, as I sat in my apartment, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. It was a photo of me, standing in the warehouse, staring at the monitors, and in the background, barely visible in the shadows, was the figure I'd seen on the screens. I haven't slept since. It was just past midnight when the call came through. A dispatch about a disturbance in an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The kind of place people made up stories about, but never dared to visit. It was supposed to be a quick check, just another prank from the local kids or a neighbor complaining about imagined shadows. I'd been with the department for 5 years, long enough to know that the scariest thing you usually find is a stray dog or a squatter trying to stay warm. But that night was different. Pulling up to the property, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not just the absence of voices or distant hums of life, but a dense, smothering silence. No wind, no insects, not even the faint rustle of leaves. My radio buzzed faintly, static, punctuated by words breaking in and out. "Unit 3, you there?" I grabbed the mic and responded, but nothing went through. "Perfect," I muttered, stepping out of the car. The flashlight beam cut through the night, tracing the overgrown lawn and the crumbling structure ahead. A flickering porch light gave the place a heartbeat of eerie illumination. I approached the door. It was ajar, barely, just enough to whisper an invitation. "Police!" I called out, trying to sound commanding, though my stomach was already tying itself in knots. My voice didn't echo. It just vanished, swallowed by the air inside. I stepped in, and immediately I knew something was wrong. The house reeked of mildew and something else. Something sharp, metallic, almost like blood. My flashlight swept across the walls, peeling wallpaper and furniture left to rot. Each step on the warped floorboards sounded deafening in the oppressive silence. "Police!" I shouted again, louder this time. Still, no echo, no response. Just the oppressive, suffocating quiet. Then I saw it. In the living room, a chair sat in the center of the space, completely out of place amidst the decay. It was pristine, gleaming wood, a deep red cushion, like it had just been placed there. I approached cautiously, the beam of my flashlight bouncing erratically as I moved. As I got closer, I saw something on the cushion, an old black and white photograph. It showed a woman sitting in that exact chair, staring directly at the camera. But her face was blurred, like someone had swirled the image while it was developing. The edges of the photograph were damp, smudging the ink onto my gloves as I picked it up. The sound of footsteps above me froze my blood. Heavy, deliberate steps crossing the length of the floor above. My hand went to my holster, instinctively pulling my weapon. "This is the police," I yelled, my voice cracking slightly. "Come down with your hands up." The footsteps stopped. A long pause. Then, a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. My flashlight flicked toward the staircase, the beam trembling in my shaking grip. The stairs groaned, one by one, as whatever was upstairs began descending. I held my breath as the dragging sound got louder, and then I saw it. First, a pair of feet, bare, pale, smeared with what looked like mud or blood. Then the rest of the figure came into view. A man, emaciated, with sunken eyes and a hollowed-out face. He was dragging a large object behind him, wrapped in what looked like a stained sheet. "Stop right there," I ordered, my gun trained on him. He didn't stop. His mouth opened, stretching unnaturally wide, as a low, guttural growl poured out, inhuman and guttural. I fired a warning shot into the ceiling. The sound was like a bomb going off in the silence. For a moment, it seemed to freeze him in place. Then he dropped the bundle and lunged at me with a speed that defied logic. I stumbled back, firing twice. The shots connected, but he didn't stop. His face twisted into a grotesque grin as he tackled me to the ground. I fought to keep him off, the stench of his breath, rotting meat and decay, overwhelming me. His strength was impossible, his bony fingers clawing at my face and neck. I managed to kick him off and scrambled to my feet, backing toward the door. That's when I heard the sound behind me, the dragging. I turned my head just enough to see the bundle he'd been carrying. The sheet was moving, shifting, as if something inside was trying to get out. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I bolted out of the house, nearly tripping over the uneven steps of the porch. My car was still running, the headlights casting long shadows that danced across the overgrown yard. I jumped in, slammed the door, and threw it into reverse, the tires spinning in the dirt. As I sped down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was standing on the porch watching me go. But he wasn't alone. Shapes were emerging from the house, figures just as pale and gaunt as he was, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Back at the station, I tried to explain what happened. I even had my body cam footage to back me up. At least, I thought I did. But when I handed it over, the file was corrupted. Nothing but static and strange distortions. The photos I'd taken of the house, blank. My superiors dismissed it as stress, a trick of the mind. I wasn't the first officer to respond to that address, they said, and I wouldn't be the last. I couldn't sleep for weeks after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, that twisted grin, those glowing eyes watching me. I moved out of town, transferred to a different department, but the nightmares followed me. A few months ago, I got curious, stupidly so. I looked up the address, hoping for some kind of closure. The house burned down not long after my call, killing the man inside. No bodies were recovered, at least not human ones. But the part that haunts me the most, the photo I found. Every so often, I'll wake up in a cold sweat, and I swear I can see it on my nightstand. That same woman, sitting in that chair, her blurred face watching me from the darkness. It started on a call like any other. A dispatch about a disturbance on Lincoln Avenue, a rundown stretch of road I've driven 1,000 times. Routine, I thought. But nothing about that night would be routine. I'm an officer, and my job is to answer calls, no matter how bizarre they might sound. The caller reported screams, frantic footsteps, and what they described as shadows chasing shadows. Dispatch didn't think it sounded credible, but they sent me anyway. Pulling onto Lincoln Avenue at 3 a.m., I slowed to a crawl. The street was empty, the kind of silence that presses on your ears until you swear you're hearing whispers. My patrol car's headlights cut through the night, bouncing off the cracked windows of old shops and boarded-up buildings. Then I saw her, a woman sprinting down the middle of the street. She was barefoot, wearing a torn dress, her face twisted in sheer terror. I rolled down my window to call out to her, but before I could, she stopped dead in her tracks, her neck snapping around like she'd heard something I couldn't. She screamed, and that's when I saw it. Something moving behind her. But there was nothing there. Not at first. I jumped out of the car, flashlight in hand, and yelled for her to stop. She ran toward me, sobbing, begging for help. Her words were a jumbled mess, but I caught bits and pieces. It's coming. Invisible. It touched me. Suddenly, she was lifted off the ground. No hands, no wires, nothing. Just her body, rising like a marionette. Her feet dangled in the air as her screams turned to choking gasps. My instinct was to run to her, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like the air around me had turned solid. I could only watch as her body twisted unnaturally, her arms and legs contorting in directions they shouldn't go. Then, her head snapped. She fell to the pavement in a heap, lifeless. The silence returned, thick and heavy. My radio crackled with static, but no voices came through. I approached her cautiously, flashlight shaking in my grip. Her wide, glassy eyes stared up at me, mouth frozen, mid-scream. There were bruises around her neck, bruises that didn't look like they came from human hands. I called for backup, but deep down, I knew no one would believe what I just saw. As I waited, something caught my eye. A shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising off asphalt. It hovered where the woman had been lifted. My heart pounded as I reached for my gun. The shimmer moved toward me, slow and deliberate. I fired. The bullet hit something. The shimmer flared, twisting like a living thing in pain, then vanished. But the air didn't feel any lighter. Whatever was out there, I knew it wasn't gone. When backup arrived, I didn't tell them everything, just that I found her like that. The official report chalked it up to a hit and run, the case marked unsolved. But I couldn't let it go. That was the night I learned about the Tartarus Archive. But that's a story for another time. For now, just remember, not everything you see on Lincoln Avenue is real, and some things you don't see are more real than you'd like to believe. Weeks passed, but the image of that woman's body didn't leave me. Every night, I drove down Lincoln Avenue on my patrol, scanning for something, anything, to make sense of what happened. But the street stayed empty, a scar on the city's map. I became obsessed. I started digging through old police files, hoping for patterns. Reports of disappearances on Lincoln Avenue dated back decades. Most were written off as runaways, accidents, or unexplainable events buried under paperwork. But some officers, those who worked late shifts on the avenue, had left chilling notes in the margins of reports. Felt watched, couldn't see anything, but it was there. I tried to share my concerns with my partner, but he brushed it off. "Don't go looking for ghosts," he said. But I couldn't stop. One night, my obsession nearly killed me. I was parked on the avenue, engine off, windows cracked. It was quiet, too quiet. Then, a sound, a faint hum, like static, but coming from nowhere. My skin prickled. I stepped out of the car, flashlight in hand, and looked around. That's when I saw the shimmer again. It was closer this time, less subtle. The air seemed to bend around it, distorting the empty street like a funhouse mirror. My gut screamed at me to get back in the car, but something about it was magnetic. Against all reason, I stepped closer. The shimmer moved. It was fast, darting down the street like a predator circling its prey. My flashlight flickered, then died. My gun felt useless in my holster. And then, I heard the whisper. "You shouldn't be here." It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was in my head, but louder than my thoughts. I stumbled back, the whisper growing into a deafening roar. Shapes began to form in the shimmer, elongated limbs, hollow eyes, twisted mouths that didn't belong on any living creature. They flickered in and out of existence, like they couldn't fully cross into our reality. I ran. Back in the car, I threw it into drive and sped off. My radio crackled, voices cutting in and out. "Officer down on Lincoln Avenue." The voice wasn't mine. When I reported the incident, I was met with silence. My captain gave me a long, hard look, then dismissed me for the night. 2 days later, I was called into his office. He handed me a file labeled Classified Tartarus Division. Inside were grainy stills from security footage, the woman I'd seen that night, the shimmer, and other images, faces contorted in terror, bodies suspended in midair, shadows that didn't belong to anything human. He said only one thing: "You didn't see anything." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I combed through the Tartarus file in secret. There were names of other officers, all with eerily similar accounts, all sworn to silence. A few had gone missing. That's when I found the recording. It was from a patrol car on Lincoln Avenue, time-stamped 5 years ago. The dash cam footage showed an empty street at first. Then, the shimmer appeared. The car's engine revved, but the officer never escaped. The shimmer enveloped the vehicle, and within seconds, the footage cut to static. The officer was never found. I requested a transfer the next day. Now, years later, I'm hundreds of miles away from Lincoln Avenue, but the whispers still haunt me. Sometimes when it's quiet, I'll hear the hum, faint but unmistakable. I've learned to ignore it. But if you ever find yourself driving down Lincoln Avenue late at night, and the air feels heavy, like it's pressing down on your chest, don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop. The first time I saw her was through the cracked screen of a police body cam. "Dispatch, suspect unarmed but acting erratic," the officer muttered as his footsteps echoed down the shadowed alley, his breath clouded in the frigid night air. Every exhale, a whisper of tension. The camera bobbed with his steps, capturing the shimmer of frost on the brick walls and the distant glow of streetlights. Then she appeared. She was crouched by a dumpster, her back to the officer, swaying ever so slightly like she was listening to music only she could hear. Her hair, long and dark, clung to her like seaweed on a corpse. The officer called out, his voice steady but sharp. "Ma'am, this is the police. Are you all right?" She didn't turn around. Instead, she raised a single hand, a pale skeletal thing with fingers too long, almost insect-like, and scratched the air. Slowly, methodically, like she was carving something unseen into the fabric of the night. "Ma'am," the officer repeated, more urgent now. He stepped closer, boots crunching on broken glass. That's when she moved. She didn't stand or turn around. She simply twisted. Her neck rotated far beyond what should have been possible, vertebrae cracking like dry twigs, until her face was staring back at the camera. Her eyes were enormous, hollow pits, swallowing the weak beam of the officer's flashlight. And her mouth, God, her mouth, stretched into a grin that could split a human skull. The body cam glitched. For a moment, the screen was static, the audio a shrill, grating scream. When the feed returned, the alley was empty. The woman was gone. "Officer Monroe, what's your status?" Dispatch buzzed, but Monroe wasn't responding. His body cam showed nothing but the open alley now, the flashlight beam trembling as it panned across damp brick walls. Then, with a wet, guttural crunch. The camera fell sideways. The last thing it captured before going dark was a streak of blood pooling into the frost. I shouldn't have seen that footage, but I did. And now she's found me. For 3 days after seeing that footage, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of my apartment, every shadow caught in the corner of my eye felt alive, as if it carried the echo of her grin. Monroe's body was never found. The official report chalked it up to gang violence in the area, but I knew better. That thing, whatever it was, had taken him. I work in law enforcement too, just not on the front lines. My job was to review body cam footage for ongoing investigations, compiling evidence for court cases. After Monroe's footage, I told myself I'd misinterpreted what I saw. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a camera malfunction, or exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But the night after I filed the footage, I got a message in my inbox. Unreviewed Incident 1127 code, redacted. It was flagged for immediate review, a case assigned to me, and only me. At first, I thought it was a mistake. No one spoke to me about it. No directives came through, just the video file. I shouldn't have clicked on it, but I did. This wasn't from Monroe's district. The footage came from across the city, 3 nights after his disappearance. It showed 2 officers responding to a break-in at a derelict industrial warehouse. Their body cams revealed the scene: rusted machines coated in dust, walls lined with graffiti, and corridors that seemed to stretch forever into the dark. "Anyone here? Show yourself," one officer barked, his flashlight slicing through the shadows. His partner covered his 6, their footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. And then they heard it. Laughter. It was faint at first, barely audible. A child's giggle. But as they moved deeper, it grew louder, distorted, the pitch warping until it sounded less like laughter and more like the twisted cries of something mocking human joy. "Cut the crap," the second officer shouted. "This is your last warning." The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the darkness around them. That's when the flashlight beams caught movement. Something darted between the rusted machines, too fast to track. The officers shouted, raising their weapons, but it was no use. The thing emerged, not running, but crawling, limbs too long, joints bending the wrong way. It skittered toward them with impossible speed, its hollow eyes reflecting the light like mirrors. One officer fired. The gunshots echoed, deafening in the emptiness. The creature stopped, crouched on all fours, and cocked its head. It didn't bleed. It didn't fall. It simply stared, grinning that same skull-splitting grin. Then it lunged. The camera feed erupted into chaos. Flashes of limbs, screams, static. The footage ended abruptly. I shut my laptop, heart pounding. My apartment felt suffocatingly quiet. Too quiet. And then I heard it. A faint scratching noise. At first I thought it was coming from the walls, maybe rats or the old pipes. But as I sat there frozen, I realized it wasn't the walls. It was my window. I turned slowly. The blinds were drawn, but I could see the silhouette behind them. Something tall, with fingers too long, was tracing patterns in the glass. Slowly, methodically. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed, staring at that shadow. Minutes. Hours. Finally, I mustered the courage to reach for my phone. My fingers trembled as I dialed 911. 911? What's your emergency? "There's someone outside my window," I whispered. "Can you describe them?" The scratching stopped. The blinds fluttered, as if touched by a faint breeze. Then slowly, they began to part. "No," I stammered. No. Sir, are you there? Sir?" It was her. That face. That impossible grin. Her hollow eyes bore into mine, as she pressed her palms flat against the glass, her nails scraping in a slow, deliberate rhythm. She leaned closer, her grin widening, until the corners of her mouth began to tear. I dropped the phone. I don't remember what happened next. One moment I was in my living room. The next I was sprinting down the fire escape, barefoot and half-dressed, into the freezing night. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest precinct, pounding on the doors like a lunatic. When they finally let me in, I tried to explain what I'd seen, but no one believed me. The footage from Monroe's body cam, gone. The unreviewed file, deleted from the system. They pulled up my personnel file and flagged me for mental health evaluation. I quit the next day. Now I'm writing this from a motel on the edge of town, lights blazing, a chair propped against the door. I don't think it'll matter. Wherever I go, she'll find me. If you're reading this and you work with police footage, take my advice. Don't click on anything marked redacted. And if you ever hear laughter in the dark, run. Don't look back, because no matter how fast you run, she'll be faster. It was just past midnight when my phone buzzed. The caller ID flashed restricted, but something about the timing felt off. I was home alone, sprawled on the couch with a half-empty beer and some late-night TV reruns. The sound of the phone ringing in the quiet room was like a scream. I hesitated but answered anyway. Hello? A voice, frantic and low, whispered, "Are you home? Lock your doors. Now." I froze, every muscle in my body tightening. "Who is this?" The line clicked dead. Normally I'd brush it off as a prank call or some weirdo, but the tone, that panicked edge, stuck with me. I stood up, every creak of the floor making me flinch, and went to the front door. It was already locked, but I double-checked. Windows, secure, back door, latched tight, satisfied. I sat back down, laughing nervously to myself. Then I saw the police cruiser pull into my driveway. The patrol car's lights weren't flashing, but its mere presence was enough to make my stomach churn. A tall officer stepped out, his silhouette sharp against the dim porch light. He knocked twice, and I debated for half a second whether to open it. "Mister?" His voice carried through the door. I answered cautiously, opening it just enough to meet his eyes. "Yeah? Something wrong?" "We received a report of suspicious activity in the area," he said. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed, but something in his eyes. It wasn't just concern. It was fear. "Have you seen or heard anything unusual tonight?" Well, I got a weird phone call a few minutes ago," I admitted. "Told me to lock my doors." The officer nodded, his hand resting lightly on his holstered gun. "May I come in?" Something in me screamed not to let him, but he was a cop. What else could I do? "Yeah, sure." As soon as he stepped in, I noticed the tension in his shoulders. He was scanning the room like he expected someone or something to leap out at any moment. "What's this about?" I asked, trying to mask my growing unease. He hesitated, then motioned toward the living room. "Can we sit? I'll explain everything." We sat. He didn't take off his hat, didn't relax. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and lowered his voice. "There's been an incident nearby. I need to ask, have you noticed anything strange in the past week? People following you? Strange vehicles parked outside?" My heart skipped a beat. "No, nothing like that. What kind of incident are we talking about?" He glanced toward the window, then back at me. "A break-in. But it's more complicated than that. The suspect might still be in the area." I felt the weight of his words settle like a lead blanket. Before I could press for details, the police radio clipped to his shoulder crackled to life. "Unit 47 report. Suspect confirmed near Elm and 3rd. Proceed with caution. All units advised." The officer shot up, his hand immediately gripping his gun. "Stay here," he ordered. "Lock the door behind me. Don't answer for anyone but the police." And just like that, he was gone, the red and blue glow of his cruiser fading down the street. I locked the door as he instructed, but the silence that followed was unbearable. That's when I noticed something. The basement door. It was slightly ajar. I stared at the basement door, my pulse roaring in my ears. I was sure I had closed it earlier. Positive. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to call the officer back, but my phone sat uselessly on the coffee table. I wasn't even sure I could move. Then came the sound. A soft, deliberate creak, like someone shifting their weight on the wooden basement steps. I backed away instinctively, eyes locked on the gap where the door hung slightly open. The living room suddenly felt suffocating. Every shadow stretched longer, every sound amplified. I grabbed the nearest thing resembling a weapon, a heavy floor lamp, and inched closer to the door. "Hello?" My voice barely broke a whisper. Idiotic. As if I wanted a reply. The silence was deafening. Then came a slow, scraping noise, like metal dragging against the wall. My heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest. "Look," I stammered. "I don't know who's down there, but the cops are already here. They're coming back any second." Nothing. And then, almost imperceptibly, I saw it. A flash of movement low to the ground, at the edge of the basement's shadows. I stepped back, holding the lamp like a bat, and shouted, "I'm armed. Come out now." The basement door slammed shut. Hard. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't have time to think. My brain screamed run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Then the floor lamp's light flickered and died, plunging the room into a thick, oppressive darkness. And that's when the doorknob started to turn. The logical part of my brain was gone, overtaken by pure primal fear. I bolted for the kitchen, skidding on the tile as I grabbed the biggest knife I could find. The house was silent again. But I knew I wasn't alone. I tried to force my trembling fingers to dial 911, but the phone buzzed with a new notification. A single text message: "Get out." The number was restricted. As if on cue, the basement door creaked open. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed on the stairs. I pressed myself against the far wall of the kitchen, knife in hand, when I saw him step into view. It wasn't the cop. The man was tall and wiry, his face obscured by some kind of crude mask, a burlap sack with slits for eyes. He held a crowbar in one hand, tapping it rhythmically against the wall as he stepped into the living room. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he rasped, his voice low and gravelly. "Come out now, and I'll make it quick." I froze, barely breathing, as he scanned the room. His head tilted, and he sniffed the air like a predator. Then he turned, heading for the hallway that led to the kitchen. I wasn't going to wait for him to find me. As soon as his back was turned, I bolted. I sprinted through the side door into the yard, knife still clutched in my hand. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran toward the street, praying the officer's cruiser would still be close. Instead, I saw two figures standing in the shadows near the curb. "Help!" I screamed, desperate, running toward them. They stepped into the light. It was the officer. But standing next to him was another man, wearing a matching police uniform. Same height, same build, same badge. My brain struggled to process it, and before I could stop myself, I blurted, "What?" The officer I'd let into my house earlier raised his gun. "On the ground, now." I didn't move. Couldn't. The other officer, the real one, looked just as confused as I felt. He put a hand on his holster, his expression sharp. What's going on here?" The man with the gun didn't answer. His eyes darted toward the house, and for a fraction of a second, I saw it. The tiniest shift in his demeanor. Panic. He wasn't a cop. "Drop the gun," the second officer barked, stepping forward. And then, chaos. The fake cop turned and bolted, disappearing into the dark. The real officer chased him, shouting into his radio for backup. I stood there trembling, clutching my knife, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Behind me, from the open basement door, came a low, guttural laugh. I didn't wait. I ran. The real police arrived minutes later. They searched the house, the basement, the yard, but whoever or whatever had been there was gone. No fingerprints, no sign of forced entry. Nothing. The officer who'd chased the imposter returned, his face pale. He told me the man had vanished into the woods, leaving behind a discarded mask and the empty shell of a police cruiser. "That guy in your house?" the officer said, his voice grave. "He's been posing as law enforcement for months, breaking in, stalking people. You're lucky to be alive." Lucky. That word stuck with me. I moved out of that house the next day, left the city altogether. But every night I still wake up in a cold sweat, hearing the creak of the basement stairs. And sometimes, when my phone buzzes in the dark, I still see those words, "Get out." I didn't believe the warnings at first. I mean, who listens to whispers about a desolate highway anyway? But this wasn't just any road. It was Ridgeway Stretch, a winding path through the middle of nowhere. My night shift had just ended, and my brain was buzzing too much for a straight route home. Something about the idea of open roads under a pitch-black sky seemed soothing. I should have stayed on the main road. It started harmless enough. The hum of my car, the faint rhythm of late-night radio, and the vast emptiness stretching ahead. But something felt off. The moon, which had been full and bright, vanished behind clouds, plunging the world into a darkness so thick my headlights barely made a dent. Then I saw it. A figure on the side of the road, just standing there. I slowed down, debating whether to stop. They didn't wave, didn't move, just stood still like they were carved out of the darkness itself. Something about the way they leaned slightly forward felt wrong, like gravity was holding them in place unnaturally. My instinct screamed, "Keep driving." So I did. But as my car rolled past, the headlights flickered, and I swear I saw the figure twist its head to watch me. Only there were no eyes, just hollow pits. My chest tightened, and I floored the gas pedal. The car roared forward, the speedometer climbing past 70, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The road felt endless, curving in ways it hadn't before, twisting like a serpent. My GPS blinked out, replacing my destination with static. That's when the radio crackled to life. A voice, low and distorted, seeped through the speakers. "You shouldn't have ignored me." I nearly swerved off the road as the voice hissed through the car's speakers. My heart pounded so hard, it felt like it was rattling my ribs. The radio wasn't even turned on. I'd switched it off minutes ago, fed up with static. But here it was, alive and taunting me. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Long shift, dark road, adrenaline. Classic ingredients for a good scare. That's all it was. At least, that's what I told myself until my headlights caught movement up ahead. Something darted across the road, low and fast, like an animal. I slammed the brakes hard, skidding to a stop. The silence afterward was deafening. My car idled in the middle of the stretch, headlights illuminating nothing but empty asphalt and the distant shimmer of mist. Then came the sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from above. I froze, staring at the roof of the car. The tapping grew louder, sharper, like nails scratching at metal. My breath hitched as I glanced at the rearview mirror. The interior was pitch black, but for a moment, I thought I saw movement behind me. A subtle shift of a shadow that shouldn't have been there. Gripping the wheel tighter, I slammed the car into gear and sped off. The tapping stopped instantly, but the relief didn't last. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. Look in the mirror. I didn't want to. God help me, I didn't want to. But my eyes betrayed me, flickering up to the rear view. The shadow was back, but now it had form. A figure hunched low, its head almost brushing the roof. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel it staring at me, the weight of its presence pressing down on my chest. No, I whispered, shaking my head, as if denying it could make it disappear. My foot pressed harder on the gas. The engine whined, the car shuddering as it hit 90, then 100. The road narrowed, trees closing in like a tunnel, their branches clawing at the sides of my car. The figure didn't move. It just sat there, its presence growing heavier with each passing second. Then, in a voice that sounded like rusted metal scraping glass, it whispered, "You can't outrun it." I screamed, swerving wildly. The car clipped something, a signpost or maybe a guardrail, and spun out. Time slowed as the world flipped. Metal groaned, glass shattered, and for a horrifying moment, I thought I was going to die. But I didn't. When the car finally stopped rolling, I was upside down, hanging by the seatbelt. Blood dripped from a gash on my forehead, my breaths shallow and rapid. The silence was suffocating. I fumbled with the buckle, crashing down onto the cracked windshield. Every muscle in my body screamed as I crawled out of the wreckage. The night was eerily calm. My car lay in a mangled heap, steam hissing from the engine. The road was gone. I wasn't on Ridgway Stretch anymore. I wasn't anywhere. Around me was an endless expanse of fog, shifting like it was alive. Then I heard it, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Slow, deliberate, growing closer. I turned, my legs trembling, and saw the figure emerge from the mist. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. "What do you want?" I screamed, backing away. It didn't answer. Instead, it reached out with a hand that wasn't a hand. It was more like a claw, made of shadows. And then, it spoke. "You left the road. Now you belong to me." I woke up in my bed, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. The clock read 7:06 a.m. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, warm and familiar. It was just a nightmare, a terrible, vivid nightmare. But as I sat up, my body aching, I realized something was wrong. The clothes I was wearing were the same ones from the night before, torn and stained with blood. My car keys were still in my pocket, sticky with grime, and etched into the palm of my hand, as if burned there, were 3 words: "Don't come back." I haven't driven at night since, and if you're ever tempted to take Ridgway Stretch for a shortcut, let me save you the trouble. Whatever's out there, it doesn't like visitors. The highway was empty, except for my old sedan cutting through the cold, humid night. The yellow lines on the asphalt blurred as I sped up, my fingers tightening on the steering wheel. Every so often, my headlights would catch the silhouette of a road sign or an old skeletal tree, their shadows stretching and shrinking across the cracked pavement. I shouldn't have taken that detour. It started as a routine trip home. Work had bled into the late hours, and I'd left the office with nothing on my mind but getting back to bed. The regular route was closed, some roadwork or an accident. I didn't pay attention. My GPS offered an alternative, a back road that wound through what looked like endless farmland and forest. At first, the dark quiet was soothing, almost peaceful. But then I noticed something unsettling. A shape in the rearview mirror. A light. Faint at first, blinking intermittently far behind me. I slowed down, expecting it to vanish like a trick of the eye, but it didn't. It grew stronger, steadier. A single glaring white orb, bouncing over the road, speeding closer. At the next intersection, I turned off without hesitation, tires screeching against the asphalt. The road narrowed, trees crowding in on either side, and the light disappeared. I let out a shaky breath. Probably just another driver, I told myself. A farmer or a trucker, out late. That's when the radio crackled. It was off. I was sure of it. Off and silent, like it had been all night. But now it hissed, faint voices slipping in and out of static. I glanced at the dashboard, confused, and almost didn't notice the figure in the road until it was too late. It appeared so suddenly, my chest tightened. A man stood directly in my path, his hand raised like he was signaling me to stop. I slammed the brakes, my car screeching to a halt. Heart pounding, I leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. The man was pale, unnaturally so, his face hollow and his clothes rumpled. He didn't look homeless, though, or drunk, more like something misplaced. His lips moved, but I couldn't hear him. My gut told me to drive, but curiosity won. I cracked the window. "What are you doing out here?" I called, my voice shaking more than I liked. The man's lips stopped moving, his head tilted, neck bending in an unnatural angle. Then, in a voice as clear as if he were sitting beside me, he whispered, "You shouldn't have stopped." Every instinct screamed to press the gas and go, but my body froze. It wasn't just fear. It was something heavier, like the air had thickened, rooting me to the spot. Then the man moved, not toward me, backward. His feet shuffled awkwardly as he retreated into the shadows, his figure melting into the trees. The radio hissed louder now, the static broken by faint guttural sounds that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Before I could act, the light reappeared in my rearview mirror. This time it wasn't distant. It flooded the inside of my car, so bright it washed out the world outside. My foot found the pedal, and I sped off, the light chasing me like a predator. I floored the gas pedal, the old sedan groaning as it sped down the winding road. The blinding light in my rearview mirror didn't falter. It grew brighter, closer, swallowing the world behind me. My hands gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles ached, and the forest on either side blurred into an endless wall of black. The radio screamed now. No music, just static and garbled voices, as if 100 people were shouting underwater. The sound clawed at my brain, making it hard to think. I reached for the dial, desperate to shut it off, but it wouldn't budge. A figure appeared ahead, standing in the middle of the road again. It wasn't the man from before. It was taller, thinner, its limbs unnaturally long. Its head lolled to the side as if it couldn't hold it up. And its eyes. God, its eyes glowed the same blinding white as the light behind me. I yanked the wheel to the left, narrowly avoiding it, and felt the car's tires hit gravel. My heart stopped as the vehicle skidded, the steering wheel jerking out of my hands. I was certain I'd crash into a tree, but the car swerved back onto the road as if pulled by an invisible force. That was when I heard the laughter. It wasn't from the radio or the road. It came from inside the car. I didn't dare look around. My eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, where the forest began to thin, revealing a stretch of open field. The laughter grew louder, more distorted, echoing in my ears. I couldn't tell if it was mocking or joyous, but it chilled me to my core. "Keep driving," a voice whispered from the passenger seat. I couldn't stop myself. I glanced over. The passenger seat was empty, but for a brief moment, the shadows seemed to shift, forming a faint outline of a figure hunched over, watching me. Its face was obscured, but its presence pressed on me like a physical weight. The light in the rearview mirror was gone now, but I didn't dare slow down. My car roared across the field, the tires thumping over uneven ground. The open space should have felt like relief, but the darkness here was heavier, more oppressive. It swallowed the stars and the moon, leaving only my dim headlights cutting through the void. Then my engine sputtered. No, I muttered, slamming my foot on the pedal. The car jerked forward but lost speed, its protests growing louder with each passing second. Finally, it rolled to a stop, the engine clicking as it died. The headlights flickered, then went out, leaving me in absolute darkness. For a long moment, there was silence, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching over the dirt behind me. My breath hitched, my entire body trembling. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to turn on its flashlight, but it slipped from my hands and fell somewhere under the seat. The footsteps stopped. A faint glow appeared in the distance, the same orb of light I'd seen earlier. It hovered, pulsating like a heartbeat, and slowly began to move toward me. I scrambled out of the car, my legs weak, my body screaming to run, but unable to obey. The orb floated closer, illuminating the field in its eerie, shifting glow. And then I saw them. Figures stood all around me, their outlines faint and flickering, like static on an old TV. They were just outside the orb's reach, encircling me. Their faces were blank, no features, no eyes, just smooth, pale surfaces that tilted toward me as if watching. The orb stopped a few feet away, hovering in the air. I stared at it, mesmerized, as it began to change. Its light dimmed, revealing a swirling, gas-like surface that twisted and turned. The figures stepped closer, their movements jerky, unnatural. I forced myself to move, stumbling backward. My hand brushed against something cold and metal. The car's door. Without thinking, I climbed back inside and locked the doors, as if that could protect me. The orb didn't follow. Instead, it began to stretch and shift, forming a long, thin shape that resembled an arm. The limb extended toward the car, its fingers tapping gently on the windshield. Tap, tap, tap. The radio crackled to life again, this time with a single clear voice. Run. The orb exploded in a blinding flash of light, and I screamed, shielding my eyes. When I dared to look again, the figures were gone. The field was empty, silent, except for the faint hum of my engine sputtering back to life. I didn't question it. I slammed the car into gear and sped off, not caring where the road led, as long as it was away. The orb's glow lingered in my rearview mirror for miles, like a distant star, before finally fading into the night. I made it home just before dawn, my hands still trembling as I shut the door behind me. Sleep didn't come that morning, or the next night. I still see the orb sometimes, in the corner of my vision, when I'm driving alone, and I never ever take the back roads anymore. It's a quiet November night, and you're driving along a winding country road, the kind that feels endless, flanked by skeletal trees clawing at the dark sky. The kind of night where even the stars seem to shy away, leaving you under a dome of oppressive blackness. Your high beams carve a narrow path ahead, illuminating only the cold asphalt and the occasional reflector post. You weren't supposed to take this road, but the GPS rerouted you due to an accident on the interstate, and now you're here, on this godforsaken road, miles from anywhere. And then you see it. A figure. It's standing at the edge of the road, barely illuminated by your headlights. Instinctively, your foot eases off the accelerator. They're not waving you down, not signaling for help. They're just standing there, facing the road, facing you. Your brain tries to rationalize it. Maybe it's a stranded motorist, a jogger. But why here? Why now? The figure doesn't move. It's when you draw closer that the dread sets in. They're dressed in a coat far too light for the weather, their head hanging at an angle that makes your neck hurt just looking at it. You squint, heart hammering. Their face is obscured, shadowed, or maybe featureless. Your gut screams at you to keep driving. Just keep going. Don't stop. But something, some damnable magnetic pull, makes you slow down. You stop the car about 20 feet away. The figure doesn't react. It's as if they don't notice your car or don't care. You flick on your brights, flooding the road with light, and they're gone. No, not gone. Moved. You see them now, but they're off the road, deeper into the trees, standing just at the edge of the beam's reach, still as a statue watching. You don't know why, but you roll down the window just a crack. Maybe it's curiosity. Maybe it's that human instinct to do the worst possible thing in a dangerous situation. Your voice feels small in the yawning silence. Hey, you need help? No response. The figure doesn't move, but the trees behind them sway slightly in the wind, or at least you think it's the wind. It's hard to tell because you hear nothing. No rustle of leaves, no distant hum of crickets, just the engine's low growl and your own breathing, sharp and uneven. You start to second-guess yourself. Maybe you imagined them moving off the road. Maybe your tired brain is playing tricks. But then your headlights flicker. Not off, not entirely, but enough to make your stomach drop. The beams dim for a split second, and when they come back, the figure is closer. Much closer. They're at the edge of the ditch now, their face, or the void where their face should be, angled directly at you. Your chest tightens as you realize you can't make out any features. No eyes, no mouth. Just a smooth expanse of pale skin. And then you notice something else. Their hands. Long. Wrong. Like talons, hanging just a little too low, the fingers unnaturally thin and curling slightly, as if they're waiting to grasp something. Your survival instincts kick in. You slam the window shut and put the car in gear. You're not staying here. Not tonight. Not for anyone or anything. The tires screech as you take off, but as the car lurches forward, you feel a weight, a pressure, like someone's holding the back of the car, the rear view mirror. You know you shouldn't look, but your eyes dart to it anyway, and they're there, perched on the trunk, their hands splayed out against the glass, fingers stretching impossibly long. They're still featureless, but you swear you can feel them looking at you. Through you. You scream and stomp the gas. The car roars, the tires find grip, and for a second, you think you're free. The figure slides off the back, disappearing into the dark road behind you. Relief washes over you in a cold wave, but then something taps the window. Once, twice, a rhythmic knock, deliberate and unhurried. It's coming from the passenger side. You whip your head around. The figure is sitting in the seat beside you, impossibly calm, hands resting on their knees like they've been there the whole time. The inside of the car reeks now, like wet earth and decay. You don't even think. You wrench the wheel to the side. The car fishtails, and you barely manage to keep it from rolling as it screeches to a halt in the middle of the road. You throw open the door and bolt into the woods, leaving the car behind. Branches slash at your arms and face as you run. You don't know where you're going, but anywhere is better than here. The figure doesn't chase you, at least not in the way you expect. You can't see them, but you feel them. Their presence is heavy, like the air is pressing down on you. Every shadow seems alive, every sound amplified. Finally, you burst into a clearing and collapse to your knees. The moonlight bathes the open space, giving you the first sense of security you've felt all night. You take a moment to catch your breath, the cold seeping into your skin as you sit there trembling, and then you hear it. The knock. Once, twice. You whip around, and there, at the edge of the clearing, the figure stands. Only now, they're not alone. Dozens of them emerge from the trees, identical and featureless, their long fingers curling and uncurling as they close in. They form a perfect circle around you, their movements synchronized, their heads tilting in unison. Your scream catches in your throat as they close the gap, their smooth faces mere inches from yours. And then, blackness. When you wake up, you're in your car. It's parked neatly at the gas station you stopped at before this nightmare began. The sun is rising, the orange glow spilling over the horizon. The engine is off, your keys in your lap. Everything looks normal, except for the muddy handprint smeared across your windshield.